Arizona's midnight highways don't just have stories, they have records. On these dark desert roads after midnight, dispatch calls vanish from the system. Phones keep trying to send messages from confirmed dead zones. Prison logs show inmates present days after they're documented dead, and more than one report describes a barefoot girl quietly asking for a ride on a closed stretch of highway. Tonight on Haunted Fears, you'll hear 11 real events taken from night shift reports, police logs, and witness testimonies, cases that defied explanation, shadows that refuse to fade. Where are you watching from right now? And what time is it on your clock? Drop your city, country, and local time in the comments below. It helps the Haunted Fears crew understand just how far these midnight road stories travel. If you're watching alone, consider this your personal flashlight emoji from the Haunted Fears community. Hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss future investigations. My name is Braxton, and the night I learned what people really mean when they call Highway 93 Blood Alley started like every other shift I've worked in the Arizona desert, with the kind of fatigue that settles behind your eyes and makes the world feel just a little bit unreal. I'm an EMT, and if you work in this part of the state long enough, you end up driving that stretch between Wickenburg and the nothingness beyond more times than you can count. You get used to the rhythm of it, the way the last gas station lights thin out behind you, the way the road narrows and the shoulders crumble into open desert, the way the stars feel closer out there than they do anywhere near Phoenix. That night, just before midnight, I'd finished a transfer run and was dead-heading back south in the rig. No partner, no patient, just me, the ambulance, and an empty two-lane cutting through miles of pitch-black scrub. The air was cool for once, with a dry wind sliding across the hood and a faint smear of orange glow far behind me where the last little edge of town was. My dashboard clock flipped from 11:57 to 11:58 p.m. Just as I hit the long, lonely section, the older guys on my crew call the corridor. We all know its real name. Some of the veterans have a different one for it. The same one you sometimes hear from troopers when they think you're not listening. Blood Alley. I used to think that was just dark humor for a dangerous highway, but after that night, I don't say it casually anymore. The first strange thing I noticed wasn't supernatural at all. It was how quiet the radio was. On a normal night, you at least hear some chatter. Units checking in, dispatch tones, somebody calling for a plate check. That night, the airwaves were dead. I flipped between our primary channel and the County 1, then the state patrol feed, and got nothing but the low hiss of open carrier. It made the cab feel hollow, like I was sealed inside a moving shell with the outside world switched to mute. The ambulance box behind me rattled in its usual way over the expansion joints, and the light bar cast a faint red reflection on the top of the windshield from the standby LEDs. But there were no other headlights visible either direction, just me and a tunnel of halogen stretching ahead. I tightened my grip on the wheel as I came up on the first cluster of roadside memorials I knew by memory. Those white wooden crosses people hammer into the gravel where someone didn't make it home. In daylight, they look sad but ordinary. At midnight, with high beams on, they looked like a crowd pressed just beyond the shoulder, each cross catching the light so it flashed bright and then vanished again as I passed. I've always respected those markers. I've transported enough mangled bodies off this road to know every cross means someone's last breath was taken in that exact strip of dust. But this time, as I rolled by the first group, something about them made my skin crawl. They seemed brighter than usual, like they were catching more light than they ought to. One of them, a taller cross with a sagging plastic flower, shimmered faintly from the base up, as if there were heat waves rising off it even though the night was cool. I blinked, thinking maybe my eyes were just dry, but the feeling didn't go away. A mile or two later, another cluster appeared, then another, each one briefly flaring bone white in the beams, and then dissolving back into the dark. I told myself it was just the way my headlights were angled, nothing more, and I reached over to nudge the volume knob on the radio, even though there was nothing there to hear, just to have something to do with my hand. About 15 minutes into that silent stretch, the weather changed in a way that didn't make sense. There'd been no fog in the forecast. It almost never happens out here the way it does near rivers and towns, but as I crested a low rise, I saw a pale curtain lying ahead, like the road was diving into smoke. It wasn't blowing across the pavement either. It was settled low, hugging the asphalt and the thin strip of dirt beyond. When I drove into it, the world telescoped down to the reach of my headlights. The stars disappeared, the desert vanished, and all I had were the yellow lines sliding under my front bumper and the reflective posts creeping by at regular intervals. Even the faint orange sky glow from behind was gone. I slowed from 70 to 50 without thinking, conscious of how many times I'd treated survivors who said, "I hit this patch of fog," and never finished the sentence without describing twisted metal. Inside the cab, the sound changed. The wind noise softened, replaced by a dull roar from the tires and a weird muffled echo of my own engine. It felt like being underwater. That's when I saw the wreck. It was just ahead, on the right shoulder, half in the lane, half in the dirt, a sedan on its side with its undercarriage facing me, headlights still burning, one wheel spinning slowly in the air. My brain did what it's trained to do: brake, check the mirror, steer around, assess. My foot went hard to the pedal, the rig shuddered, and I swung wide into the oncoming lane to pass, my hand already dropping to the radio mic. In that fraction of a second, my eyes cataloged things, without my permission. The crumpled roof, the dark smear on the pavement that looked a lot like fresh fluid, the shattered glass glittering in my beams. And then, just as the front of the ambulance drew level, everything disappeared. Not faded, not dissolved into the fog. Gone, like someone had cut to a different frame. I jerked the wheel back into my lane, heart hammering, and almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. Road mirage, fatigue, leftover adrenaline from the earlier transfer. I forced myself to breathe slowly, counting every inhale and exhale, focusing on the white line at the edge of the road and the rhythmic thump under the tires. A minute later, the radio crackled to life, making me jump so hard my knee hit the steering column. But it wasn't dispatch. It was static, punctuated by faint sounds that could have been voices or just interference. Then, under it, I heard something that made my chest tighten. The distant, high-pitched ping of an impact sensor, the kind that sets off when a modern car detects a severe crash. I'd heard that tone plenty of times in mangled vehicles, usually just before the battery died completely, or we disconnected it. I thumbed the mic. "Base, Medic 1. You copy?" Nothing coherent came back, just a squeal and a hiss. I flipped over to the state patrol frequency. "Any unit on 93 near Wickenburg, this is an ambulance southbound. Anyone working a wreck out here?" More hiss. Somewhere in the noise, I thought I heard someone say my unit number, and then a word that might have been negative, but it was swallowed before I could be sure. My skin prickled with that feeling you get when a storm is about to break, except the sky outside my windshield was just a blank gray wall of fog. Another curve approached, a gentle one I knew well, arcing around a shallow wash where flash floods sometimes cut across the road. I eased into it, eyes scanning ahead, and there it was again. The same sedan, same angle, same half-on, half-off position on the shoulder. This time the passenger side faced me, caved in like it had taken a direct hit from something heavy. The windshield was cracked in a spiderweb pattern, and in the split second before my high beams washed over it and past, I saw a hand pressed against the inside of the glass. The skin looked too pale, the fingers too long in the glare, and there was a smear trailing down from the palm, a slow, wet line. My training told me to stop. You don't pass a scene like that. But something deeper in me, some animal part that had nothing to do with protocols, screamed not to pull over. I forced myself to act anyway, yanking the rig onto the shoulder a safe distance past where the car had been and throwing it into park. The second I did, the world fell abruptly still. The fog seemed to thicken around the windows, swallowing even the faint reflection of my own parking lights. For a heartbeat, I just sat there, fingers locked around the steering wheel, listening. The engine ticked as it idled. The clock on the dash said 12:09 a.m. I should have already been closer to town by then, but the distance didn't feel right in my head anymore. I keyed the radio again, voice tighter than I wanted. Base, Medic 1. I may have a single vehicle rollover on 93, somewhere north of Wickenburg. I'm attempting to locate. Radio check. Silence, then that same thin wash of static, like a shower running in another room. My hand hovered over the door handle. That was when I saw movement in the side mirror. At first, it looked like just another flutter of fog sliding past the ambulance, but as I stared, I realized there were shapes in it, darker patches that moved with purpose, not with the wind. They stayed just at the edge of the red glow cast by my rear lights, too far back to make out clearly, but close enough that my brain filled in the gaps with human outlines. 1, 2, 3. More. Standing where the shoulder met the dirt, in the same place that long line of roadside crosses had been earlier. The longer I stared, the more distinct they became. The suggestion of shoulders, hunched, as if from impact. Heads turned slightly toward the road, one figure with what looked like its arm raised in a half-hearted wave. Tell yourself it's just the fog, I thought. Get out, walk back, do your job. I cracked the driver's door, and instantly the soundscape changed again. Instead of the muffled quiet from inside, the night hit me with a layered mix of noises that did not belong together. I heard the whine of tires skidding on asphalt, a horn blaring in one long, uninterrupted note, glass shattering, metal folding. All of it distant and close at the same time, like it was echoing down a hallway that didn't exist in the physical world. Underneath it was another sound I couldn't place at first. A soft, high sob, over and over, too rhythmic to be real crying, more like a recording looped imperfectly. I swung my boots onto the gravel, leaving the headlights on and the engine running, my flashlight in one hand. The air smelled wrong. No dust, no desert plants, just the faint chemical tang of coolant and the coppery edge of blood that any medic recognizes immediately. But there was no wreck in front of my ambulance, no crumpled sedan, no skid marks. The pavement stretched ahead in my high beams, slick with a thin sheen of moisture from the fog, but otherwise clean. I walked toward where I'd seen the car the second time, counting my steps, every instinct on full alert. When I reached the spot, my light found nothing but disturbed gravel at the shoulder, and just beyond it, a cluster of crosses I hadn't seen from the cab. There were 6 of them, all different heights, some old and splintering, some newer, with bright white paint. One had a little stuffed animal wired to it, the fur rotted by sun and weather. Another had a laminated photo stapled to the wood, the face inside blurred by condensation and age. My beam passed over them quickly, then snapped back. On the closest cross, someone had written a date in thick black marker. The year was a few years back. One I remembered clearly because that was when we'd had a particularly bad run of fatalities out here. That wasn't what made my throat go dry. What did it was the time written under the date in smaller letters. 12:09 a.m. The exact minute on my dash clock when I'd stopped the rig. Behind me, the ambulance's engine idle stuttered, then smoothed out again. The radio crackled, and a voice came through so suddenly and clearly that my heart leaped. Medic 1, what's your 20? It was our dispatcher, sounding tinny, but blessedly normal. I raised the mic clipped to my shoulder, eyes still locked on that handwritten time. Medic 1 is northbound on 93, somewhere between mile marker. I turned to look for a sign and froze. The stretch of road in my headlights had changed. It took me a second to understand how. The reflective posts that had been lining the shoulder were closer together now, every few yards, instead of spaced wide apart. and every single one of them cast a shadow against the fog, long and human-shaped, all angled toward the center of the lane, as if something stood just out of sight, leaning toward the passing vehicles. Medic 1, repeat last. You're cutting out, the dispatcher said. Her voice wavered at the edges, like it was coming through water. I swallowed hard. I'm on 93 north of Wickenburg, I said, forcing calm into my tone. Experiencing heavy fog. I thought I saw a vehicle on its side, but I don't have a visual now. Can you confirm any current calls on this stretch? Static swallowed my words and then spat out a response in pieces. Negative. No active. That corridor tonight. Then, after a pause that made my skin crawl, the line carried a different sound. Not my dispatcher, not any unit I recognized. It was a recording, old and faint, but EMTs learned to recognize the cadence of certain calls. Multiple vehicles, rollovers, need additional units. Can't get through. It happened so fast. The timestamp at the start of the recording, barely audible, hit me like a fist. The same month and year as the date on that cross. I backed slowly toward the open driver's door, keeping my eyes on the road, on those impossible, shifting shadows. As I moved, one of them seemed to detach itself from the line of posts, sliding closer without actually crossing the beam of my flashlight. It stopped just at the edge of the light, a darker smear against the already dark fog. For a second, I could have sworn I saw the outline of a face within it. Features half-formed, like someone trying to emerge from underwater. The air around me felt thicker, harder to pull into my lungs. I didn't run. That would have meant taking my eyes off it, but every step backward felt like pushing through syrup. Inside the cab, with the door slammed shut and the locks engaged, the fog outside looked almost normal again, just a heavy ground mist curling around the headlights. My hands were shaking as I dropped into the seat and grabbed the wheel. I told myself to do the logical thing, mark my GPS coordinates, wait for a trooper, follow procedure. But there was a different logic operating out here, one I didn't understand but felt in my bones. It said, "You're not supposed to be stopped on this stretch at this hour. Whatever claimed those people doesn't like it when the living linger." My dash clock still read 12:09, even though I knew more than a minute had passed. The second hand was twitching in place, jerking back and forth over the same 2 ticks. I put the rig in drive and eased back onto the asphalt, half expecting to feel the bump of a body or debris I hadn't seen. The tires rolled smooth. As soon as I straightened out in the lane and picked up a little speed, the radio cleared. My dispatcher's voice came through, crisp as ever. "Medic 1, you're still not showing on GPS. Can you confirm your status?" I glanced at the unit screen. The little icon representing my ambulance was frozen several miles back, where the long, lonely stretch had begun. I answered, my voice sounding distant in my own ears. "Medic 1 is code 4, continuing southbound. No scene found. I searched for a word that wouldn't sound insane. Experiencing visibility issues. I'll advise at the next mile marker." She acknowledged, routine and calm, and the normalcy of that exchange kept me from losing it entirely. The fog began to thin after a few miles, breaking into ragged patches that my headlights tore through. The stars reappeared in the sliver of sky I could see over the windshield. The orange glow of Wickenburg grew a little brighter on the horizon. When I finally passed an actual physical mile marker sign, green and solid and reassuring, I read the number twice and then radioed it in. My GPS icon jumped suddenly to match my location, as if whatever hold that corridor had on my signal had finally let go. Back at the station, when I logged my mileage and times, the numbers didn't add up. According to the trip sheet, I'd covered that problematic stretch of highway in less time than usual, not more, despite slowing and stopping. My onboard system showed no GPS data for a window of about 12 minutes, as if I'd driven off the grid entirely. The radio logs had a brief gap too, A slice of time where my unit ID simply didn't appear. When I asked dispatch about the weird fragment of an old call I thought I'd heard, she frowned and shook her head. "We don't have anything like that queued up," she said. "And there haven't been any multiple rollovers out there for months. Not officially, anyway." She tried to make a joke about my rig being haunted, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. A few days later, on my own time, I drove that way again in my personal truck, in broad daylight. I pulled over where I thought the crosses had been and walked the shoulder. They were there, 6 of them, sun-bleached and ordinary in the harsh Arizona light. The date on the closest one was the same I'd seen in the fog, but in the sun I could read the rest of the inscription clearly. Under the time, someone had written a short message. "We called. No one came in time." I stood there longer than I meant to, the roar of passing traffic making my shirt flutter against my back, and thought about all the times we'd raced down this road with lights and sirens and still arrived too late. Since that night, I've worked plenty more shifts, driven countless miles on 93. I still see wrecks, I still see crosses, but I avoid pulling over on that particular stretch after midnight unless I'm directly dispatched to a scene, and even then, I approach with a different kind of respect. When rookies joke about Blood Alley, I don't correct them. I just tell them quietly, or to keep their speed reasonable in the fog, and to never, ever ignore a roadside memorial cluster at night. Out here, time and distance don't always behave the way they should, and some calls never make it into the official system. Some cries for help hang in the dark, looping forever in that low place between mile markers, waiting for a response that can never come. If you ever find yourself driving that road alone after midnight, and your radio goes dead, if you see wreckage that vanishes when you blink, or headlights in your mirror that don't belong to any car you can pass, do yourself a favor. Keep moving, keep your eyes forward, and remember that sometimes the dead aren't trying to hurt you. They're just trying to get someone, anyone, to finally answer. My name is Zoe, and if you've ever scrolled through those dreamy Route 66 travel reels at 3 in the morning, you've probably seen a version of the shot I was chasing that night. A lone car on cracked pavement, abandoned buildings collapsing into the desert behind it, and a sky so full of stars it looks like static. I make a living turning places like that into aesthetic loops for people who will never actually stand there. That probably sounds cynical, but it's the truth. So when I tell you I went looking for the prettiest kind of empty and found proof that it wasn't empty at all, you can believe me or not. The algorithm doesn't care either way. I was driving west on I-40, a little east of Flagstaff, just past midnight, when the sign for Meteor Crater went by in my headlights. The sky that night was ridiculous, clear, cold, and full of hard, bright stars. It made the highway feel like a strip of film unspooling into space. My headlights this tiny, fragile cone of light in an ocean of black. I'd already hit my planned stops for the day, but that's the thing about chasing content. The best shots are almost always the ones you didn't schedule. I'd read about the ruins at Two Guns, the half-collapsed stone buildings out by Canyon Diablo, the old roadside zoo, the so-called Apache Death Cave. In daylight, it's a ghost town attraction. After midnight, it's the kind of place you expect to see on a true crime podcast thumbnail with the words "last known footage" stamped across it. The exit ramp came up sooner than I expected. 1 second I was humming along with cruise control set. The next I was signaling and dropping speed, tires thumping over the grooves cut into the shoulder. There's a weird, suspended feeling when you pull off an interstate into darkness that thick. The noise drops, the lane lines disappear, and suddenly you're trusting this narrow strip of old road not just to get you somewhere interesting, but to be there at all. My GPS showed a pale gray thread labeled Frontage Road, Old 66, running parallel to the freeway. No streetlights, no other cars. Just the hum of my engine, and way off to my left, the rushing whisper of trucks barreling past on I-40. The farther I drove, the more that sound thinned out, like someone turning a volume knob down. It was replaced, gradually, by a different kind of silence, the heavy kind that deserts keep after dark. Not quiet, exactly. There's always wind, and the tiny movements of things living in the scrub, but thick like sound has to push harder to exist. I found the turnoff I'd pinned earlier, a cracked stretch of old pavement peeling away from the main access road, slipping toward the ruins. The pavement used to be part of Route 66. Now it's technically just a frontage road, but in the dark it felt like the real thing, like I'd driven off the map and onto a piece of film history. My headlights picked out the low shapes of stone, walls, skeletal outlines of buildings without roofs, an old signpost with nothing on it anymore. The air had that dusty, abandoned smell you get near structures that haven't been lived in for decades. Dry wood, sun-baked concrete, whatever trace of human presence that hasn't blown away yet. I parked at an angle facing the ruins, killed my engine, but left the parking lights on and sat there for a second, fingers still curled around the wheel. The stars outside were so bright, they threw a faint, grainy light over everything. If I turned off my lights entirely, I knew my eyes would adjust, and the ruins would become a flat silhouette against the sky. That would have been smarter. It also would have meant no quick exit if something felt off. I compromised. Parking lights only, engine off, keys between my fingers just in case. This is the part where I should say I felt a chill, or the air grew colder, but it didn't. The temperature was exactly what a high Arizona desert night should feel like. Crisp, thin, breathable. The wrongness crept in sideways, in the way my car sounded like it was indoors. Every little click of the cooling engine, every creak of the plastic dashboard, echoed just a hair too long, like there were surfaces around me I couldn't see, reflecting the sound back. I shook it off, grabbed my phone and my mirrorless camera from the passenger seat, and stepped out. Gravel crunched under my boots. The quiet was heavy enough that the sound felt rude. Above me, the Milky Way smeared across the sky, a wash of white that no light pollution bled out here. It was perfect. That was the problem. It was the kind of perfect you point a lens at and forget everything else. Rehook or not, I need you to understand this. I didn't come here looking for ghosts. I came here looking for content. I've slept in my car at rest stops most people wouldn't use the bathroom at, just to catch golden hour in some forgotten canyon. I've filmed in abandoned motels where the only things moving were tarantulas on the carpet. Nothing had ever followed me home in a way I couldn't explain with a shrug and a weird, right? Route 66 is full of stories, but most of them are just that, stories. Two Guns, though, is different. Between the old zoo cages, the burned-out trading post, and the canyon with its history of people disappearing into it, you don't have to invent much. The place supplies its own atmosphere. I walked toward the nearest building, a low rectangle of stone with its roof gone and its doorway gaping, my phone's flashlight cutting a cone through the dark. Wind skated through the empty window holes, making a low, breathy sound. My camera hung from its strap against my chest, already powered on, lens cap off. I lifted it, framed the ruin against the sky, and hit record for a slow pan. On the tiny screen, everything looked exactly like it should. The jagged top of the wall, the tumble of debris below, the smear of stars, wheel tracking in time-lapse mode. But as I tilted the camera to follow the line of the broken roof, a flicker crossed the center of the frame. A shape. A person-sized shape. It was there, and gone so fast my brain filed it under compression artifact, and moved on. I stopped the clip, scrubbed back a few seconds, and replayed. At first, nothing jumped out. Then, right as the camera drifted past the empty doorway, the pixels in that dark rectangle seemed to congeal into something like a silhouette. Shoulders, head, the faintest suggestion of a face turned toward me. No features, just the outline. I frowned, replayed it again, then lowered the camera and looked up at the actual doorway. Empty. The light from my phone fell straight through into the interior and out the far side window, painting the opposite wall. There was nowhere for anyone to stand without showing up in my beam. Okay, I muttered to myself, the sound absurdly loud in the open air. Glitchy autofocus. Chill. Talking out loud helped. It made me feel less like I'd stepped into a photograph and more like I was still in a three-dimensional place. I moved on, following the cracked pavement as it curved gently, hugging the contour of Canyon Diablo's edge somewhere out in the dark. The old animal pens were farther along, squat concrete enclosures with chain-link sections that had long since rusted and fallen. The stories online say this used to be a roadside zoo where they kept cougars and other animals to lure in tourists. The ethical nightmare of that aside, what got me was the sound. As I walked, the wind shifted, and I heard something riding on it, faint, high, and unmistakable, a distant yipping, like coyotes. Except it wasn't quite right. The cadence was off, stuttering, like a recording skipping. It would start, rise, cut, start again from the middle. I stopped walking, turned slowly in a circle, and tried to triangulate where it was coming from. My ears told me ahead and to the right. My phone's audio, when I looked down at the waveform bouncing on the screen, said something else entirely. The peaks were registering behind me. I pointed my flashlight back the way I'd come. The beams from the interstate were a low glow on the horizon now, a suggestion more than a presence. The ruins I'd walked past stood in still, expectant rows. Nothing moved. My own breathing sounded like it belonged to someone else. I flipped my camera to stills, lifted it, and snapped 3 shots in quick succession, sweeping from left to right along the old pavement. The shutter clicks were sharp little stabs of sound in the quiet. Somewhere out there, a big rig rolled by on I-40, a distant rushing whoosh that came and went like something exhaling. I lowered the camera, swallowed, and kept walking toward the animal pens. They were stranger up close than they looked in the daylight photos I'd seen. The concrete was stained in patterns that hinted at years of water, waste, and God knows what else soaking in. Some of the rusted fence posts still leaned at odd angles, as if they were bracing for impact. I filmed a slow sweep across one of the empty enclosures, trying not to think about the stories tied to the Apache death cave below the site, where people had died in horrible ways more than a century ago. I don't love mixing tragedy with aesthetic, but the internet does, and I'm complicit. As my camera traced the curve of the pen, my phone buzzed in my pocket. The violent little shake made me jump. There's no cell service out here, not really. I'd checked earlier. I pulled it out anyway. No new notifications, no signal bars. Just the time, which read 12:23 a.m., and the word emergency calls only, where my carrier name should have been. When I looked back at the camera screen, I realized I wasn't alone in the frame. Someone was standing in the middle of the old frontage road about 30 feet behind me, perfectly centered. They weren't illuminated by my flashlight, but they were lit somehow, edges sharp against the dark. A tall figure, maybe, or medium height. It's hard to judge scale in that washed-out night vision look. The head was tilted, just slightly, like they were listening to something. My heartbeat slammed hard enough that my arms wobbled. I swung around, raising the flashlight. The beam cut across empty road and low scrub, catching a scattering of broken glass and a rusted barrel. No person. No footprints in the dust where they should have been standing. Just my own boot marks leading back toward the car. My brain, trying to save me from myself, grabbed for the most boring explanation. Long exposure ghosts. The camera was on a sensitive setting. Any sudden movement while I was panning could have made a faint echo of my own body hang in the frame. That's all. Except I'd been careful. Tripod steady. No wild swings. And the outline on the screen had been facing me, not aligned with how I was standing at the time. I forced myself to breathe, to test reality in small, measurable ways. I said my own name out loud just to hear it. My voice bounced back a fraction of a second too late, as if the ruins were answering with a delay. I told myself the delay was in my head. I decided that was enough walking around. The frontier between spooky and stupid is thin when you're alone. I headed back toward my car, every nerve tuned to the patch of darkness just outside the reach of my phone light. The old pavement felt softer underfoot than it had on the way out, like it had absorbed more than just heat over the years. When I reached my car, relief hit me like a rush of warm air. The familiar shape, the dashboard glow, the mess of empty coffee cups and gear in the passenger seat, all of it screamed normal life. I climbed in, shut the door, and locked it, more for the ritual than out of any real belief that a Subaru door lock was going to be my line of defense against whatever. I set the camera on my lap, plugged it into the USB to charge, and let the preview screen play back my last few clips. At first, it was what I expected. The ruin under the Milky Way, smooth and slow, the slow pan across the animal pen, the texture of concrete and rebar almost pretty in the harsh light, the empty road stretching off into black. Then the road clip rolled past the point where I'd last checked. The camera had kept recording a few seconds longer than I'd remembered. In those extra seconds, the middle of the road didn't stay empty. One by one, people appeared. Not in a horror movie jump cut, but in that quiet, wrong way bad edits sometimes overlay frames. Transparent at first, then solidifying. 3 figures, then 5, then more, all standing in a loose group right where my tire tracks would be if I pulled forward. They weren't moving. They weren't looking around. They were all facing the camera, shoulders squared, like a crowd waiting for a speech. I couldn't see their faces. The stars behind them bled through their outlines, as if they were made of a thinner kind of dark. I froze, fingertip pressed so hard to the back of the camera that a little half-moon dent bloomed in my skin. The urge to look up, to check the windshield, was almost overwhelming. But that ancient, leftover animal brain inside me hissed, "No," like if I didn't break eye contact with the screen, whatever was on it couldn't cross over. I scrubbed backward, forward, trying to catch them in the act of appearing. The closest thing to a beginning was a moment where the camera picked up a faint, flickering distortion in the air above the pavement, like heat waves. Then the shapes thickened, took on edges, and there they were. The road around them looked slightly different too, shinier maybe, like it was wet. I hadn't noticed any dampness under my boots. From somewhere out beyond the car, too far away to be specific and too close to ignore, came that skipping coyote sound again. A rise, a cut, a repeat, like someone was fast-forwarding and rewinding a recording in place. Then layered beneath it, something else, a low rhythmic murmur, words, almost, a chant. The syllables were blurred by distance and the car's thin metal walls, but the pattern was there. Rise, fall, pause, rise, fall, pause. I turned off the camera's audio to make sure it wasn't coming from the playback. The chant didn't stop. In fact, without the tiny speaker's hiss, it sounded clearer. Rehook if you need one. The thing that finally made me believe none of this was in my head wasn't the figures on the screen or the chanting. It was the way something hit my car. Not a vague thump you could blame on settling metal, but a solid, open-handed smack right against the rear quarter panel on the driver's side. The whole vehicle rocked. My breath slammed out of me in a noise I'd be embarrassed to hear on a recording later. A second slap followed, on the opposite side near the back door, as if someone had walked around and hit it again for emphasis. I twisted in my seat, keys already in my hand, hit the ignition, and jammed my thumb on the door lock switch, even though it was already down. The engine caught, the dashboard flared awake, and in the brief moment before I threw it into reverse, I saw the inside of my rear window, in the dim reflection from the screen. There were handprints on the glass. Not clear, juicy horror movie smears, but dusty, perfect outlines. Fingers spread, palms flat, one on each side, exactly where the hits had landed. The dust on this car had been uniform when I pulled off the highway. I'd watched it collect in the mirror for days across New Mexico and Arizona. Now there were 2 places where it had been wiped away in the shape of hands pressing from the outside in. I slammed the gear shift into reverse and backed onto the frontage road without doing the careful check I usually do. Nothing was behind me. I would have known, the way you know without looking when someone else is in the room. I straightened out, shifted into drive, and aimed the car back toward the ramp that would take me up to I-40. As my headlights washed over the old pavement one last time, my peripheral vision insisted there was a group of people standing on either side of the road, just beyond the beam. Not doing anything dramatic, not lunging or chasing, just standing, the way people stand at the edge of a small-town parade, watching cars go by. I kept my eyes locked on the lane ahead and didn't give them the satisfaction of a direct look. The chanting grew louder for a few seconds, then stopped completely as my tires left the rough old asphalt and hit the smoother, newer surface of the access road. By the time I merged back onto the interstate, my hands had stopped shaking enough that I could set cruise control again. It wasn't until a few exits later, under the relative safety of freeway lights at a truck stop, that I got out and checked the rear of the car. The handprints were gone. Not smeared, not faded. Gone, like the dust had resettled exactly the way it had been before. A uniform gray film over the glass. My camera still had the footage. Back at home, days later, and hundreds of miles away, I pulled the clips into my editing software and stepped through them, frame by frame, on a real monitor instead of a tiny screen. To my relief and my horror, the crowd in the road was still there. The chanting, however, was not. The camera's audio picked up only wind and a faint hum from the interstate. Whatever I'd heard had never been recorded. The shapes never resolved into faces either. No dramatic reveal, no clear ghost to freeze on and circle in red for a thumbnail. Just a group of people made of thinner darkness, standing on an old road in the middle of nowhere, watching me. I haven't posted that footage, not yet. It lives in a folder on an external drive labeled with a project name I'll probably never use. I still make aesthetic travel content. I still chase lonely roads and broken neon signs. But when people romanticize abandoned roadside attractions, I think about how crowded that old Route 66 frontage road really was that night and how that crowd didn't care about followers or engagement. They weren't looking for an audience. They were the audience. The ruins at Two Guns might be empty during the day, but after midnight, the show goes on. If you go out there with a camera, ask yourself a simple question before you hit record. Are you filming them, or are they finally getting a chance to see you? My name is Chase, and if you've ever driven the I-10 between Phoenix and Tucson, in those dead hours between 2 and 3 in the morning, you already know it can feel like the whole world has narrowed down to your headlights and the faint orange smear of the city shrinking in your rearview mirror. I've spent more nights than I can count on that stretch, shuttling people to and from the airport, running deliveries when the daytime app work dries up, watching the same exits slide past like mile markers in a looped dream. I'm ex-military. I've done convoys overseas. I've white-knuckled armor through places where you don't pull over, unless you're willing to accept you might not leave again. So when I tell you that a simple empty car return on the I-10 is the only time I've ever felt like I was being hunted on American asphalt, understand that my threshold for calling something wrong is higher than most. It was a clear, dry night, the kind where the desert air feels like it's been baked clean of moisture and the stars hang low and hard above the black line of the mountains. Phoenix was a fading glow behind me. Tucson still a suggestion far ahead, and the traffic had thinned to almost nothing, just an occasional pair of headlights cresting a distant rise, then gone. The job was easy on paper. A regular airport client had flown into Phoenix but needed their car in Tucson the next morning. The company I drive for sometimes pays us to reposition vehicles like that. Pick up the car from long-term parking, drive it down, leave it in their driveway with the keys in a lockbox. Decent money, quiet ride, no chatty passenger watching the GPS. The only catch that night was the hour. By the time I cleared the airport loop, found the car, checked the paperwork twice, and merged onto the interstate heading southeast, it was already a little after 2 in the morning. I wasn't worried. Barely any traffic, no weather, tank full. The desert was cool but not cold, the kind of temperature that makes the steering wheel feel just right under your hands, and the cruise control held steady a few ticks over the limit. The engine hummed. The road stripes flashed under the headlights in hypnotic rhythm, and that faint orange dome that clings to big cities at night slowly dimmed in my mirrors. I had the radio off. It's funny. Most people assume rideshare drivers live with noise, podcasts, playlists. On lonely runs like this, I like to hear the car itself, the way the tires change pitch over different asphalt, the whine of wind slipping around the frame, my own breathing. Sometime past Casa Grande, the traffic dropped from light to almost none. There was a semi far ahead in my lane, its taillights 2 red dots bobbing gently in the distance, but no one close behind me. The other side of the freeway looked just as empty. The desert out there is a different kind of dark than you get in town. Even with the interstate lights at certain stretches, there are long runs where the only illumination comes from the occasional reflective sign and the stars above, and the sky feels wider than the ground. Off to my right, the desert spilled away into low scrub and sagos, punctured here and there by a lone billboard frame, or the suggestion of a dirt road vanishing into nothing. Off to my left, the median, and then the other carriageway, fat yellow lines separating eastbound from westbound, the occasional break where an overpass or on-ramp cut through. I don't know the exact mile marker where I saw her the first time. I've tried, and it doesn't line up neatly with any landmark I can name. What I remember is the feeling that the road ahead had stretched suddenly, like someone grabbed the horizon and pulled it farther away. The car's interior clock clicked from 2:19 to 2:20 a.m. My eyes had been doing that lazy sweep between far ahead and just in front, the way you do when you're alert but comfortable. That's when the beam from my headlights caught something pale on the right shoulder. At first, I thought it was a plastic bag caught on a bush, or a shredded tire carcass turned inside out. As I got closer, the shape resolved into something undeniably human. She was walking with her back to me on the narrow strip of asphalt beyond the white line, close enough that a misjudged drift could have clipped her. Barefoot. That was the detail my brain seized on first. No shoes. Just the pale soles of her feet flashing in the glare as she took slow, deliberate steps. She wore dark pants and a white t-shirt, the fabric hanging loose against her shoulders. No jacket, no backpack, no reflective gear, no phone in her hand casting its own little rectangle of light. Her arms hung at her sides. She didn't stick out a thumb, didn't turn or wave as my car approached. For a split second, as my lights washed fully over her, I saw the curve of one cheek in profile. It was impossible to tell her age from that angle. She could have been in her 20s or her 40s. Dark hair hung straight down, lifeless, just brushing her shoulders. Every training and instinct I had screamed 3 things at once. Don't hit her. Don't slam the brakes so hard you get rear-ended, and figure out if she needs help. I eased gently onto the left side of my lane, giving her as much berth as I could without crossing into the median. As I drew level, I flicked my eyes to the right, ready to catch her face, to see if she looked injured or intoxicated. But again, she didn't turn. It was like I wasn't there. The car slid past her, the headlight's cone moved on, and in the side window I caught one last glimpse of white cotton and bare calves before she was swallowed by the night behind me. I checked the mirror immediately, half expecting to see her stagger or step into the lane, or maybe see headlights cresting a hill behind me that I'd have to flash to warn them. Instead, the mirror showed nothing. Empty shoulder, empty lane. No small, solitary figure receding in my wake. Just the red pinpricks of that semi's taillights far ahead and the gentle curve of the guardrail catching my beams. I snapped my gaze from rear view to side mirror and back again, then craned my neck for a better angle. Nothing. The rational part of my brain tried to make excuses. Maybe she'd stepped off the shoulder into the darkness the second I passed. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks, turning a bush and a roadside marker into the illusion of a person. But the image of those bare feet on cold asphalt wouldn't let go. I told myself I'd misjudged the timing. The mind can be weird with moving objects at night. A couple miles ticked by. The semi up ahead exited or pulled so far away that its lights disappeared entirely, leaving me as the only visible vehicle in either direction. The road straightened out into one of those long, flat runs where the stripes seemed to pour towards you in an endless stream. The clock nudged closer to 2:30. The monotony crept in, the kind that's more dangerous than any storm, where your body wants to settle into autopilot and let your thoughts drift. I rolled my shoulders, blinked hard a few times, took a sip of lukewarm gas station coffee from the cup in the console. The bitter taste grounded me. Then my headlights picked up something pale on the right shoulder again. At first, it was just a smear at the extreme edge of the beams, right where the white line faded into darkness. A smudge resolving into shape. This time, my mind didn't go for debris first. It went straight to her. Same height, same dark pants, same white t-shirt glimmering in the halogen wash, same unhurried pace, like she had all the time in the world to walk a highway that barely had any cars left on it. My hands tightened on the wheel hard enough that my knuckles ached. The cruise control held my speed, steady as a metronome. I hadn't turned off or doubled back. There were no interchanges that could logically explain me encountering the same woman twice in such a short span, so far from any exit. I slid subtly toward the center of my lane again, heart thudding a little faster now. As I came up on her, my car's interior felt suddenly too small, the darkness beyond the glass too present. I could see more of her this time. The t-shirt was thin, the kind you get free at events, the kind that doesn't keep heat in. Her arms were a shade darker than the shirt in my headlights, skin the color of someone who spends time outside. No visible injuries, no obvious blood. Her head remained bowed slightly forward, hair obscuring most of her face. One hand twitched just as I passed, a small, almost graceful adjustment of balance, like she was stepping over something in the road that I couldn't see. Again, I flicked my eyes to the mirror the moment my car drew level and moved past. Again, nothing. The shoulder behind me stretched empty in both rear view and side. Mirrors, just low brush, and the repeating sequence of reflective posts. I felt a cold pressure in my chest that had nothing to do with the outside temperature. I've seen some things on night shifts. Wrecks where it's a miracle anyone walked away. Drunks lying like roadkill on the shoulder. Even a guy once who decided trotting down the median in full cowboy gear was a good idea. Real things. Messy, loud, smelly. This was clean. Too clean. Like a loop playing over reality. My first impulse was to get off the freeway entirely at the next exit, pull into a truck stop, and splash water on my face, maybe call it a night, and sleep a couple hours in the front seat. But there was a long stretch coming up where exits are few and far between, and I was in the middle of it. The gas gauge told me I had plenty of fuel. The rational voice, the one that had kept me alive in other deserts, on other roads, told me that stopping on the shoulder out here at this hour to check for a barefoot hitchhiker only I seemed able to half see was how you turned a weird story into a bad outcome. So I stayed in my lane, my fingers drumming once on the wheel before clamping down again. And I started watching not the shoulder, but the far distance where my lights faded into black. This time, when I saw her, she wasn't all the way over by the edge. She was closer to the center line. Not in it exactly, but near enough that the stripes brushed the outside of her left foot as she walked. The effect in my headlights was jarring. The white of her shirt merged weirdly with the reflective paint, making her look almost like she was part of the road markings themselves, some figure stenciled on by a crew with a sick sense of humor. The clock on the dash clicked to 2:33. The air in the car felt drier, as if the vents were pumping desert dust straight into my lungs. My mouth had gone so dry I could feel my tongue sticking to my teeth. There's a particular kind of unease you get when something that should be random happens 3 times in a row in almost the same way. 2 could be coincidence. 3 feels like pattern. I had the sense, as the beam started to paint her from the back again, that this was a threshold moment. Whatever this was, it had escalated each time, from shoulder to shoulder closer to almost on the line. If it was an actual living woman in trouble, that was bad enough. If it wasn't, then being locked in a metal box, hurtling toward her at 70 miles an hour, felt like stepping willingly into someone else's script. As the car closed the last dozen yards, she did something different. She stopped walking. Her bare feet came together on the paint, toes almost touching the stripe. Her arms, which had been hanging slack, bent slightly at the elbows. The fingers of her right hand flexed once, like she was testing them. Then, just as the full strength of my headlights washed over her, she turned her head. Not gradually, not like someone glancing over their shoulder to check the traffic, but in a single, smooth motion, as if she'd been waiting for this exact second. Her face angled toward me, toward the car, toward the windshield behind which I sat like an audience of one. I can't tell you exactly what her features looked like, because every time I try to fix them in my memory, they slip sideways. I remember eyes that should not have been able to lock with mine at that distance and in that light, but did. I remember the suggestion of a mouth that might have been closed and might have been parted, shaped around words I couldn't hear. I remember the distinct impression that nothing about her expression changed as the car bore down on her. Not flinching, not fear, not anger. Just a kind of cold recognition, as if she'd finally spotted the person she'd been waiting for all along. The dashboard went dark. Every light, the speedometer glow, the little icons on the climate controls, the backlighting on the radio, snapped off so completely it was like someone had yanked the battery cable mid-motion. The engine sound dulled, though the car didn't lurch or stall. The road outside was still there in my headlights, but it might as well have been a projection on a wall. For a handful of seconds, I had no sense of speed, no instrument panel, nothing to tell me if I was drifting. Instinct and training kicked in. I didn't slam the brakes, just eased my foot off the accelerator and kept my hands as steady as I could. My pulse thundered in my ears. The white line on the right and the dashed line on the left were my only guides now. In that weird, deadened silence, something else made itself known. The car had its windows up, the air on low, yet I heard a sound as clearly as if the glass weren't there. Bare feet on asphalt, not running, not stumbling, walking. The soft slap of skin on road paced exactly with the forward motion of the car, as if someone were matching my speed just outside my field of vision. It came from the right side, then the left, then from directly ahead, and every hair on my arm stood up at once. I kept my eyes pinned to the space where the beams died, refusing to look to the shoulder this time. I had the sudden, absolute conviction that if I sought her out deliberately in that moment, if I acknowledged her presence with my gaze instead of catching her at the edges, something would change in a way I couldn't take back. The car rolled through that dead zone of instrumentation for what felt like minutes, but when I glanced down at the dark clock face out of habit, no red digits glowed back. Time itself felt paused, stretched thin. The world beyond the windshield had narrowed down to gray pavement and black beyond, the stars overhead erased by the relative brightness of my own headlights. Even the distant glow of cities was gone. It was like driving through the center of an inkblot. The only indication that I was still in motion was the soft hiss of tires on the road and that ghost tread of bare feet keeping pace somewhere just ahead. Then, as abruptly as it had died, the dashboard came back. All at once, every gauge lit, every indicator winked on in a brief test pattern before settling. The clock now read 2:37. The engine note sharpened, the vents pushed cool air with ordinary force, and the radio's display came back to life, with the last FM station the car's owner had been listening to before I took it. Some generic classic rock song burst into the cabin at medium volume, so normal it made me flinch. My hands cramped on the wheel, then loosened. The bare feet sound stopped as soon as the lights returned, cut off mid-step. In the rearview mirror, the road behind me looked like any other stretch of I-10 at night. Empty, endless, indifferent. I didn't see her again on that drive. I watched the shoulders with a predator's focus all the way into the outskirts of Tucson, scanning every shadow and reflector post for a hint of white cotton or exposed skin, and there was nothing. The exits started coming fast, familiar names and numbers clicking past on green signs. The world felt solid again. Gas stations, warehouses, the occasional lonely diner with a neon open sign flickering in a window. The mundane ugliness of it all was a relief. I delivered the car to its destination, locked the keys in the box, sent the completion photo through the app. My hands were still trembling a little as I framed the shot, but the image came out clear. Just a car in a driveway under a sodium streetlight. Nothing to see. It would have been easy to file the whole thing under creepy highway moment, the kind of story drivers tell each other at 24-hour coffee counters. If it had ended there, I probably would have done just that. I might have chalked it up to fatigue, to the way missing sleep can make shadows conspire and memories smear. But 2 days later, on a completely different run, a passenger changed my mind about calling it nothing. I was back on the airport circuit, this time actually carrying someone in the back seat, a woman in her 50s flying in to visit family. We got to talking, as you do on late-night runs when both of you are too wired to sit in silence. She asked if I drove this route a lot at night. I said yes, more than was probably good for me. She nodded in that knowing way locals do and said, almost casually, "You ever see the barefoot lady?" The words hit me like a sudden pothole. I glanced up at her in the mirror. "What do you mean?" I asked, careful to keep my tone light. She shrugged, eyes on the dark ribbon of freeway ahead. "Used to hear about her more when I was younger," she said. "I grew up in Tucson, and there were all these stories about this woman who walks the I-10 between here and Phoenix late at night, barefoot, in a white shirt. Folks said if you stopped to help, your car would die, or you'd lose time. My dad was a trucker, and he swore he saw her 5 times in 1 year, always at almost the same mile marker. He'd say your dash lights go out because she doesn't like to see herself in the reflection." She laughed a little, but it didn't sound amused. Probably just people falling asleep at the wheel and making stories to explain it. But I still hate this stretch after midnight. I didn't tell her what had happened to me. Not then. I just made a non-committal sound and changed the subject to something safer. But later, parked in my own driveway with the engine off and the cricket singing, I sat there longer than usual, staring at the way the dashboard reflected faintly in the windshield. In that ghostly double image, for a heartbeat, I thought I saw someone sitting on the hood, head bent, hair hanging, watching me. When I blinked, it was gone. Might have been nothing. Might have been the streetlight. Might have been the residue of a story getting under my skin. Here's what I know, cut and dry. On a clear, dry night, on an almost empty I-10 between Phoenix and Tucson, I passed the same barefoot woman in a white t-shirt 3 times without ever turning around. Each time she was closer to the center of the road. The 3rd time she turned to look straight at my windshield from a distance, where no normal person's gaze should have felt that direct. And my entire dashboard went dead while the car kept moving as if nothing mechanical was wrong. I heard footsteps on pavement that didn't match my tires, paced perfectly to my speed. The power came back only after some invisible line had been crossed, and the rest of the drive was uneventful. Later, without prompting, a stranger described a local legend that fit my experience almost detail for detail. I don't have footage. I don't have a cell recording. All I have are those 3 passes, burned into the part of my brain that used to catalog potential IED threats and ambush points. If you find yourself driving that stretch alone at 2 in the morning and you see a pale shape on the shoulder that resolves into a barefoot woman walking the wrong side of nowhere, do what you want with this story. Maybe you'll slow and offer help. Maybe you'll stare straight ahead hands tight on the wheel, pretending you didn't notice. Me, I keep my cruise steady, my eyes on the lines, and I don't check the mirror too quickly. And if my dash ever goes dark again on a clear night, I'm not going to assume it's a loose wire. My name is Alice, and before that night, I would have told you I trusted numbers more than anything else on Earth. Load limits, slope angles, moisture readings in fractured rock. Data doesn't lie. That's what you tell yourself when you make a living, signing off on whether other people are safe to go into holes in the ground. I work as a mine safety engineer, which in eastern Arizona means long days inside the sprawling copper operation near Morenci, and longer nights driving back down US 191 through the mountains toward Clifton, a narrow strip of asphalt carved into rock that falls away hundreds of feet on one side and leans in like a closing jaw on the other. You're supposed to respect that road the same way you respect a live blast zone. Know your margins, never get cocky, always assume something bigger than you is waiting to punish a mistake. So when I tell you that the most dangerous thing I've ever encountered on that stretch wasn't a loose boulder or a slick curve, but a group of children who didn't cast any kind of shadow in my headlights, understand that for someone like me, that's not an easy sentence to say out loud. It had already been a long day. An electrical fault had taken out part of a ventilation system in one of the older underground sections, which meant unexpected overtime for me and a maintenance crew, tracing cabling through hot, stale headings while everyone else went home to their families. By the time we got airflow numbers back in the green and I finished my paperwork in the admin office, the on-site clock was creeping past 11:30. The mine at night is its own kind of world. Enormous haul trucks crawling up benches like lit-up beetles, distant engine noise bouncing off the pit walls, the sky soaked in the orange glow of sodium lamps. When I finally eased my pickup out of the employee lot and pointed it toward the gate, I felt that familiar mix of relief and dread. Relief at leaving the controlled chaos of the mine, dread at the prospect of the two-lane balcony known as US 181, at the tail end of a stormy winter day. Rain had come in bursts all afternoon, cold showers that turned the dust on the cut slopes to a slick skin of mud and sent rocks skittering down onto the shoulders. By the time I hit the town edge and started climbing into the switchbacks, it had eased to a fine, steady drizzle, the kind that doesn't look like much in your beams, but coats everything in just enough water to make it treacherous. The temperature hovered just above freezing. Patches of low cloud were snagged on the peaks, drifting lazily like smoke from a smoldering fire. This part of 191 has earned its reputation. Tight curves, minimal guardrails, sheer drops that disappear into blackness off the right side if you're heading north, and off the left if you're going south. Signs warn trucks over a certain length to turn back. The joke in town is that if you miss a turn up here, you'll have enough time to regret all your life choices before you hit bottom. I took it slow, like I always do, especially after a long shift. My truck's high beams cut a pale tunnel through the mist, droplets sparkling and then streaking past like falling stars. The wipers beat a steady rhythm, squeaking slightly at the end of each arc. I kept my hands relaxed at 10 and 2, my eyes moving constantly between the next bend, the contours of the rock face on my left, and the nothingness where the drop was on my right. There's a point as you climb north out of Clifton where the town lights drop away behind you in the mirror, and all you have are the reflective posts and the occasional runoff culvert to tell you where man ends and canyon begins. That night, when those last few lights vanished, an odd sense of being sealed off slid over me, like driving into a tunnel with no roof. About 15 minutes into the climb, just past a section where the road does a long U-turn around a spur of rock, I heard it. Faint laughter. Not hysterical, not menacing, just the bright, unself-conscious laughter you hear from kids on a playground when they think no adults are around. It floated through the cab even with the windows up and the fan on low, so incongruous with the hiss of the tires on wet pavement that for a second I thought it was a sound glitch in the podcast I'd been half listening to earlier. But I'd turned the audio off when I left the mine gate, and the display on the dash was blank. The laughter came again, this time from ahead and to the right, riding the thin currents of moist air slipping into the truck through whatever micro-gaps existed around the doors. I told myself it was a radio from one of the few houses clinging to the hillsides lower down, or maybe voices carried up from the valley in some weird acoustic trick. Sound does strange things in canyons. I'd written a whole memo once on how blasts were echoing unpredictably. My brain wanted to file it under the same category, but as I rounded the next switchback, I saw movement near the guardrail, a quick darting shape low to the ground, then another, then the distinct outline of a small body rushing from one side of the road to the other. My foot eased off the accelerator. Instinct, training, parental reflex, whatever you want to call it, all kicked in. Children on this road at this hour in this weather made no sense. But if that's what I was seeing, the only thing that mattered in that second was not hitting them. I feathered the brake, feeling the anti-lock hum through my boot, and dropped my speed to well under the advisory sign that had just warned me of a string of 15-mile-an-hour curves. The truck's engine downshifted, and a low growl filled the cab as it fought gravity and wet friction. On the right, just beyond the flimsy metal guardrail that pretends to be protection along some of these drops, an old dirt access road branched off, climbing steeply toward a disused bench left. Over from earlier phases of mining. I knew the spot. I'd reviewed a report once on a small slide there years back. In daylight, you can see rusted bits of equipment up that way, half buried in talus. At night, in rain, it was just a darker strip against the rock. That's where I saw them properly. 3 small figures darting around near the edge of the access track, arms flailing in that loose, excited way only children have when they're chasing each other without any sense of the danger of their surroundings. I tapped my horn, a short, sharp warning, partly to let them know a vehicle was there, partly to reassure myself that the world still worked the way it should. The sound bounced off the rock wall to my left and came back flatter, like it had lost something in the translation. The kids, if that's what they were, didn't react. No startled glance over, no freezing mid-step, no adult head turning in annoyance. They kept moving, weaving in and out of each other in a strangely synchronized way, like a game they'd played 100 times. In the smear of my headlights through the rain, their clothes looked wrong. Too neat, too stiff, like outfits picked for a school picture decades ago. One had what looked like suspenders over a pale shirt. Another's dress flared stiffly at the bottom, hemline hovering at mid-calf, not a style I've seen on any local kid in years. I slowed even more, practically crawling now, my hazard lights clicking on under my thumb almost without conscious thought. Out here, if someone's kids are messing around that close to a cliff in the middle of a stormy night, you expect a truck or a car pulled off nearby, maybe a harried parent trying to wrestle them back inside. There was nothing. No other vehicles, no porch light, no cluster of mobile home trailers tucked into the slope. Just wet rock, my headlights, and those 3 small shapes near the access road entrance, dancing in and out of my beam like fireflies. I rolled down the driver's window a crack, despite the drizzle, the cold air rushing and sharp and metallic on my tongue. "Hey!" I called out, raising my voice the way you do when you need it to carry but don't want to sound angry. "You kids need to get back from the edge. Where are your parents?" The words gusted out into the dark and were swallowed almost immediately, as if the canyon took them and decided not to give them back. The laughter came again, clearer now, unmistakably, the high-pitched sound of children playing, mixed with the occasional squeal and what might have been a shouted name I couldn't catch. And yet, under that, there was something else, a faint, overlapping murmur that made my skin prickle. A second layer of voices, a half-heard chorus that didn't sync with the visible mouths that might or might not have been moving. I eased the truck closer, my high beams aimed directly at them now. The wipers hissed back and forth, occasionally smearing the droplets into brief streaks before clearing them. In that harsh white light, the details of their clothing sharpened. Old-fashioned jackets, socks bunched at the tops of shoes that my mind labeled as Sunday best, in a way I hadn't thought about since my own childhood. Their hair was oddly uniform, neatly cut, not plastered down by the drizzle the way you'd expect. They were close enough now that if they were real, I should have been able to pick out individual features, to see the shine of eyes, the curve of noses, the small, unfocused expressions kids wear when they're lost in a game. Instead, their faces blurred. Not out of focus like a camera lens getting it wrong, but as if someone had taken an eraser to the details while leaving the outlines intact. Where there should have been eyes, there were smudges of darker shadow. Where mouths belonged, there were soft, indistinct patches that never quite settled into shape. Every time they turned in the light, the blur shifted but never resolved, like heat shimmer over asphalt hiding what's underneath. I felt a cold line trace its way down my spine, not from the air sneaking in the cracked window, but from some older, deeper layer of fear waking up inside me. The practical part of my brain tried to assert itself. Maybe it was the rain on the windshield. Maybe my glasses needed wiping. Maybe fatigue was playing tricks. I took one hand off the wheel long enough to swipe my knuckles across my lenses, blinking hard. When I looked again, nothing had improved. The kids, if that's still the right word, kept cavorting near the guardrail, their limbs moving with the jerky, repetitive rhythm of old film clips, but their faces remained maddeningly unfinished. That's when I noticed something that, for me, broke the last hinge holding this to any frame of normal. The truck's headlights were bright, brighter than most vehicles I pass out here, a perk of having insisted on upgraded bulbs after one too many close calls with elk further north. The beam cut across the wet pavement in front of me in a clear, harsh swath, throwing back distinct reflections from every reflective marker and fleck of mica in the asphalt. It spilled beyond the white line onto the shoulder, illuminating the first few feet of gravel and the base of the guardrail posts. But behind the children, under their feet, to their sides, in front of their cavorting bodies, there were no shadows. Nothing blocked the light. It passed through them as if they were projections rather than solid things. The gravel behind stayed evenly lit. The rail posts cast thin, predictable shadows on the wet ground. The kids did not. In my world, shadows are non-negotiable. They're part of every diagram, every model. Light hits matter. Matter interrupts it. A shadow is born. When that stops being true, you're either hallucinating or the universe is breaking a rule in your presence. The laugh that bubbled up in my throat then was purely defensive. Nope, I said out loud to the dashboard, to no one. Absolutely not. The absurdity of talking to a physics violation on a mountain road after midnight wasn't lost on me, but narrating helped hold my mind in place. Without fully braining through the decision, I let the truck coast to a near stop, transmission still in drive, my foot hovering over the brake. The engine idled in a low, steady rumble. The wipers squeaked. The kids continued their strange, joyous looping dance, unaffected. Then, all at once, they stopped. Every small body froze in mid-motion, arms half raised, legs half bent, like the world had suddenly switched to pause. The laughter cut off mid-peal. The only sounds were the engine and the whisper of rain on metal. In that unnatural stillness, the overlapping murmur I'd heard under the laughter swelled, filling the cab even though the window was barely open. It was like being in a crowded room where everyone is speaking at once just below comprehension, a tide of child voices, layered and out of sync, some high and tremulous, some oddly flat, all pressing in. Then, in a single, sickeningly synchronized motion, all three blurred faces turned toward me. Even without proper features, the intent was unmistakable. The blankness, where their eyes should have been aligned on the windshield, on the exact spot where my face floated in its faint reflection. The flood of overlapping voices sharpened, not into individual sentences, but into a chorus that somehow still managed to form words I understood. "Turn around," they said. Not shouted, not pleaded, stated. Over and over, in different pitches and tempos that somehow hit my ears as one command. Turn around, turn around, turn around, turn around, turn around. I gripped the wheels so hard my fingers hurt. Every accident report I'd ever read about this corridor flashed behind my eyes. Pickup trucks that left the pavement for no clear reason. Sedans crushed under fallen rock. Motorcycles that never made it around a particular bend. Rockfalls triggered by freeze-thaw cycles. Drivers misjudging wet curves. Fatigue. Behind me, somewhere in the darkness where the road curled back on itself, I heard a sound I know too well from site investigations. The deep, grinding crack of rock giving way. It rolled up the canyon like thunder, amplified by the walls, followed by the sharper pops and crashes of boulders, breaking loose and bouncing. The truck vibrated slightly under me, as if something massive had struck the mountain. The kids at the guardrail didn't flinch. Their fixed, blurred faces remained angled at me, their non-existent eyes locked on mine. "Turn around," the chorus insisted, the words buzzing at the base of my skull. Sometimes data comes dressed in numbers and graphs. Sometimes it comes as painstaking field notes and digital models. And sometimes, I realized with a clarity that cut through the fog of fear, it comes as a visceral one-time warning. You either heed or don't get the chance to test twice. Whether those voices were in my head or in the air suddenly didn't matter. Somewhere behind me, tons of rock had just reintroduced themselves to the highway. If I ignored that and pushed forward, I'd be rounding a blind curve in a drizzle on wet pavement into a fresh obstacle I might not have time to stop for. That was the rational layer. Underneath it was a simpler, older equation. I had been told, quite specifically, to turn around by something that had just demonstrated it didn't care about basic optics. I decided to listen. I eased my foot down and let the truck roll forward, enough to reach a slightly wider patch of shoulder I knew was coming up, a maintenance turnout carved into the inside of the turn. The kids didn't move as I passed them. As my beams started to slide off their forms, they seemed to thin, as if distance were dissolving them rather than darkness. By the time my side window would have put them at the edge of my peripheral vision, there was nothing there but rain and rock, and a guardrail glistening with moisture. The overlapping voices faded, leaving behind a silence that felt almost louder. I pulled into the turnout, nose pointed against the rock, and stopped. My hands went through the motions almost automatically, foot on brake, shifter into reverse, careful glance at the mirror even though I knew the road was empty. I let the truck roll backward in a slow, controlled arc, then cut the wheel and completed the three-point turn until I was pointed back the way I'd come, descending instead of climbing. For a second I sat there, hazards blinking in the dark, breathing hard enough that my chest ached. Then I eased back onto the lane and started down, every sense straining. It didn't take long to find the slide, maybe half a mile below where I'd encountered the children. The faint glisten of something irregular appeared in the beams. I slowed further, heart rate climbing again, and crept forward until the obstruction resolved fully. A jagged tumble of rock and dirt covered both lanes, spilling from the hillside down to and over the guardrail on the drop-off side. Some of the boulders were bigger than my truck's hood, fresh breaks showing pale, unweathered interiors where they'd split from the face. Mud and smaller debris fanned out farther, slick and unstable looking. It hadn't been there when I'd driven up. I would have had to snake around it. The air smelled of raw stone and disturbed earth, a sharp, chalky scent that cut through the rain. I pulled to a stop a safe distance back, angling my lights to wash over the mess. No other vehicles were present. No twisted metal pinned under the rocks. No desperate waving from anyone trapped. Just the massive, uncaring weight of geology doing what it does when enough time and water have undermined its supports. I sat there for a long moment, listening to the occasional rattle and clink as smaller pieces settled. My hands shook now in earnest, an aftershock of adrenaline my training couldn't completely suppress. The rational part of me kicked in again, grateful for something to do besides think. I slipped the truck into park, grabbed my phone, and called the county dispatch to report the slide, giving them the best estimate of the mile marker and describing the blockage. The dispatcher on duty sounded tired but alert. She thanked me, said they'd already had one other report from a driver further down who'd heard something big go, and that highway crews were being notified. She told me to stay clear, find a safe place to wait it out or turn back to town if I could. I'm already headed back toward Clifton, I heard myself say. I got lucky. I was above it. Something made me turn around. I didn't elaborate. Back in town an hour later, with the truck parked safely in my driveway and the rain finally turning to a light, half-hearted snow, I stood in the kitchen with a cup of tea going cold in my hands and tried to line everything up. Kids on an access road in the middle of the night in weather like that? No. The lack of shadows in my headlights? No. Blurred faces, synchronized turning, voices that sounded both inside and outside my head? All no. The rock slide, though, that was yes. I could have gone up there the next day, measured the angle of repose, sampled the fractured face, written a neat little report about rainfall totals and freeze-thaw cycles and long-term erosion that led to a predictable failure. It would have been accurate. It just wouldn't have been the whole story. I don't talk about the other part at work. You don't last long in mine safety if people think you're superstitious. Around here, the land already has enough real dangers without adding imagined ones. But on certain nights, when storms roll in and the scanner crackles with mention of 191 closures, I catch some of the older truck drivers looking away a little too quickly when someone jokes about the mountain deciding it's had enough. One of them, a man who's been hauling ore up and down that grade longer than I've lived in Arizona, once said quietly, "The road warns you if you listen." I didn't ask him what he meant. I just felt the hairs on my arms stand up in a way I recognized. If you ever find yourself climbing that section of US 191 out of Clifton after midnight, tires hissing on wet pavement, clouds snagged low on the peaks, and you hear laughter where there shouldn't be any, pay attention. If you see children near a guardrail whose clothes don't seem to belong to this decade, whose faces won't quite come into focus no matter how hard you look, check the way your headlights fall around them. If the light passes through without leaving a shadow, understand that whatever you're seeing may not be bound by the same rules you are, but it still might be trying to tell you something. Data doesn't always arrive in a format you can graph. Sometimes it comes as a single, impossible instruction from a chorus of voices. Turn around. Whether you call that a haunting or a warning is up to you. What you do with it could be the difference between reading about a slide in the paper the next day and becoming part of the reason they add another little white cross to the side of that narrow, unforgiving road. My name is Felix, and the night I learned a road can trap you without ever closing a lane started like every other dead-tired drive home after a swing shift. Anyone who's taken the Beeline Highway up toward Payson around midnight knows that feeling when the city glow finally falls away in your mirrors, and it's just you, the pines, and a thin ribbon of asphalt threading the dark. I just finished 8 hours at the blackjack table, breathing recycled casino air and smiling at tourists who'd already forgotten my face by the time they cashed out. The valley sat behind me as a smear of orange, shrinking with every mile. Ahead, SR-87 climbed into cooler air, the forest getting thicker, the road curling and straightening in long, hypnotic runs. I've driven that stretch so many times I could sketch half the mile markers from memory. That's why what happened stands out so sharply in my head. The road I knew by heart started acting like it had never heard of me. The air that night was damp, one of those desert evenings after a late shower, when everything smells like wet dust and hot pavement cooling down. As I left the last gas station lights near the reservation boundary, wisps of fog drifted between the dark trunks, low and aimless, not thick enough to be dangerous, just enough to make the headlights bloom. I cracked my window an inch to keep myself from getting drowsy. The cold, clean scent of pine slid in, cutting through the lingering smoke and perfume from the casino floor. Traffic was light in that way you only get on a weekday after midnight. A pickup's taillights vanished around a curve ahead of me, and in the mirror there was nothing but empty lane rolling back toward the valley. I set the cruise control a little under the limit, no point in pushing it on wet mountain roads, and settled in for the climb, hands loose on the wheel, eyes tracing that endless dance of white and yellow lines. Somewhere past where the billboards thin out and the forest really starts to close in, I came around a right-hand curve and my night changed. 1 second I was following the familiar sweep of asphalt. The next, my high beams blew open on chaos in the lane ahead. An SUV lay on its side, nose pointed toward the guardrail, undercarriage facing me, hazard lights blinking a steady, silent orange. It took my brain maybe half a second to process the picture. Metal bent at an angle that doesn't happen on purpose. Glass scattered in a glittering fan, one rear wheel still spinning lazily. My foot was already off the gas before I had words for it. Training and habit took over. Slow, scan, don't swerve into oncoming, find a safe path around. There was just enough shoulder on the left to knife past, so I rode the center line, feeling the rumble strip buzz faintly under my tires as I gave the wreck every inch I could. As I crept by, I flicked my eyes toward the cab out of reflex, looking for movement. The windshield facing up toward the trees was a spider web of cracks, interior dark. No silhouettes, no glow from a phone, no shadow of someone trying to climb out. The SUV's plate was half visible, but my brain didn't stick to the numbers. What I remember is the way the hazard lights kept pulsing in perfect time, uncaring, as if the vehicle were still sitting on a dealership lot with its blinkers on for a test. The weirdest detail in that first pass was the silence. With the window cracked, I should have heard something. Ticking metal, a running engine, a radio, a cry. There was nothing but the hum of my own car and the whisper of wet tires. Once I cleared it and eased back fully into my lane, my hands went for my phone on instinct. Out here, you don't assume someone else already called it in. I hit the hands-free, told the voice prompt to dial 911, and kept my eyes flicking between the rearview mirror and the next curve. In the mirror, the wreck went out of sight quicker than made sense. The road bent, and a wall of trees swallowed the view. The dispatcher answered, calm and flat, the way they always do. I rattled off what I'd just seen. Overturned SUV northbound on SR 87, somewhere past the reservation line, blocking at least half the right lane. No other vehicles visible. Hazards on. Unknown injuries. She asked for mile markers, landmarks. That's when I glanced at the green sign I was just passing and felt the first small tug of something off. The number on the sign didn't match where I thought I was. Not exactly. I chalked it up to fatigue. Long nights make distances smear. She had me repeat the milepost, tapped at a keyboard on her end, and after a few seconds said, "We don't have any active incidents in that area right now, but I'll log it and notify DPS. Are you able to stop safely?" I looked at the narrow, wet shoulders, the dark drop beyond the guardrail, and pictured some half-awake driver barreling up behind a parked car and a fresh wreck on a blind bend. "Negative," I said. "Not without making things worse. I'm past it now. Just let them know it's there." She told me to drive carefully and call back if I saw anything else. The call clicked off. The car felt suddenly smaller with the line open to no one. A couple of minutes later, my heartbeat had almost settled back into its normal groove. The road started doing that beeline thing, where it alternates between long, almost straight sections and tight, coiled turns hugging the hillside. The fog patches had thickened in places, hovering like low clouds snagged on the tree trunks. Every now and then, the beams would catch one just right, and it would light up from within, turning into a glowing pillar before I punched through it and left it behind. The radio showed no signal on half the presets. I didn't bother trying to find music. The sound of the tires and the wipers, swish, tap, swish, was enough to keep my brain anchored. Then I came around another bend and met the wreck again. Exact same angle, exact same position in the lane. SUV on its side, undercarriage staring back at me like a dead animal rolled over on the shoulder. Hazard lights pulsing that same steady amber. My foot hit the brake harder this time, the seatbelt locking across my chest. The world pinched down around those blinking lights. For a crazy second, I thought I must have zoned out so badly I'd actually turned around without realizing it, looping back down toward where I'd been, but the way the road leaned told me otherwise. I was still climbing. The stripes, the drop-offs, the silhouette of the ridgeline, they all said northbound, even as the scene in front of me said I'd somehow managed to lap something that shouldn't move. I squeezed myself past it again, heartbeat in my throat. As my high beams swept across the upturned windshield, something new popped into view that hadn't been there on the first pass, a long fracture running across the glass, and in the center of that fracture, a smear of dark red the size and shape of a hand, fingers splayed, palm pressed, frozen in the moment of impact. I caught it in a flash, a frame burned onto my nerves. The hazard lights threw just enough glow into the cab to make the smear gleam wet. Then my car carried me past, and the wreck vanished into the rear view, swallowed by trees, and curve again far too quickly for how close the last sighting should have been. If you've never had the road itself stop making sense under you, it's hard to explain the specific flavor of panic it brings. This wasn't a jump scare. It was worse. Every turn of the wheel, every notch on the speedometer, suddenly felt untrustworthy. I double-checked the gear selector, half expecting to see it stuck in some impossible position between drive and reverse. I glanced at my phone's map. The little blue arrow showing my car was still crawling steadily north, past the same few icons it had shown before, like the app had decided to lag by a full stretch of highway. The time in the corner ticked forward, as if nothing strange were happening. The miles left to Payson hadn't budged in the way I expected. They seemed to bounce between two numbers, like the app couldn't decide how far I'd gone. I told myself I was tired, that the wreck was somewhere below, and my brain was playing tricks with the sameness of the curves. Maybe there had been two SUVs, different crashes. The odds of that were astronomical, but absurd explanations were easier to swallow than the feeling that I'd driven into a loop I couldn't steer out of. I slowed more, dropping to a crawl that would have had impatient drivers stacked up behind me on any normal night. But there was no one. No headlights in the mirror, no glow cresting the rise ahead. Just my solitary car in a forest that suddenly felt very awake. The third time I saw it, I knew there was no coincidence left to hide behind. I'd just come out of a short straightaway and started into a left-hand curve. My eyes were already scanning the right shoulder out of habit, dreading and expecting the now familiar hulk. When it appeared, my stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with the elevation change. Same make, same color, same angle, but the scene had evolved. The windshield's crack had spidered further, radiating out from that bloody handprint like a frozen web. In the harsh beam of my headlights, I could see more detail. Streaks running down the glass, tiny shards glittering on the road, the faint shine of something metallic deeper inside the cab. The hazard lights still blinked, but one of them was dimmer now, like the battery was dying. And for the first time I realized something that made the back of my neck prickle. Despite the wreck being on its side, I heard no ticking engine, no cooling exhaust, no struggling horn or safety chime. The air around it was as quiet as the trees above, the sound of my own car's tires and wipers swallowing everything else. If this had been a real physical crash repeating itself, there should have been some mechanical signature each time, some smell of gasoline or coolant. There was nothing. I couldn't bring myself to stop next to it. Every instinct screamed that whatever logic governed this stretch right now was not on my side. Instead, I crawled past a third time, hands damp on the wheel, the car's interior feeling more and more like a capsule drifting through someone else's loop. Once I was clear, I did something I almost never do on that road. I pulled off at the first tiny dirt turnout I found, nosed the car in as far as I dared without flirting with the drop, and parked. Engine running, hazards on. I needed to reset my brain, retake stock. Sitting still might give the world a chance to catch up. The night pressed in the second I stopped moving. The pines leaned over the car, their silhouettes blotting out chunks of sky. Fog drifted across the beams in lazy sheets. I picked up the phone again, thumb hovering over the emergency call icon, then instead tapped the map. Zoomed in, zoomed out. According to that cheerful little blue arrow, I was still near the same mile marker I'd read off to the dispatcher the first time. I hadn't moved nearly as far as the odometer said I had. The road in front of me and behind me on the screen looked identical, of course. It was just a line curling through green. But the labels, the distances, they were wrong in a way I couldn't pin down. Like someone had redrawn a familiar route from memory and gotten the proportions slightly off. Sitting there wasn't making anything better. If anything, the feeling of being watched grew more intense, irrational or not. Not from the trees, not from the hillside, but from somewhere just beyond the range of the headlights down the road, where I knew, as surely as I knew my own name, that if I pulled back onto the pavement and rounded the next curve at the wrong speed, I'd find that SUV again, maybe altered in some new, more intimate way. A window rolled down, a face visible inside, a hand not just on the glass but reaching. Rehook if you need one. It's one thing to be scared of the dark, and another to realize you're afraid of repetition. The sense that a road you count on to get you home has decided you're not done paying attention yet, that you're going to see the same wrong thing until you understand you're not meant to drive past it like everyone else. I shifted into drive, took a breath that felt too loud in the small cabin, and pulled back onto SR 87. This time I turned off the high beams, forcing myself to go slow enough that the low beams could handle any surprise. The world shrank to a more manageable cone of light. The fog patches glowed softer. The road's painted lines felt closer, more real. I watched the shoulder like it had personally offended me. Muscles tensed for the shape I'd come to know in the last 20 minutes. The curve approached where I expected to see it again. The trees crowding in, the guardrail bending. Nothing. Just wet asphalt, reflectors, and the empty glossy black where the lane tipped toward the drop. I drove another half mile, another bend, another. No overturned SUV, no blinking hazards. The road, as if bored with whatever game it had been playing, had gone back to being what it always was. A slightly dangerous mountain highway that doesn't care if you're tired or not. The GPS suddenly jumped, the little arrow leaping ahead a cluster of miles like it had finally caught up to where I felt I should be. The distance to Payson adjusted, this time in a way that made sense. By the time I pulled into town, the clock on the dash reading a little later than it should have but not wildly off. I'd almost convinced myself I'd imagined the looping wreck. Long shifts do weird things to memory. Maybe I'd seen one bad crash, then spent the next dozen miles replaying it in my head so hard that it painted itself onto the curves ahead. I parked in my driveway, killed the engine, and sat there listening to the ticking of the cooling metal. The house was dark, no one waiting up. The beeline hummed faintly in the distance, its presence more a feeling than a sound. A few days later, nursing a burnt coffee in the break room before another shift, I overheard one of the older dealers talking to a slot tech about that cursed corner past the res line. He swore up and down he'd once seen the same wreck 3 times on his way home, years before. Every time I passed it, he said, it looked a little worse. Last time, I thought I saw somebody looking back at me from the windshield. Next day, nothing in the paper, no mention on the news, like it never happened. He laughed it off, but there was a tightness in his eyes that didn't match the joke. I didn't join the conversation. I just filed the details away with my own and made a quiet decision. I still drive SR 87 home after midnight. That's my schedule, and I'm not about to quit a decent job over one bad night. But I do a few things differently now. I keep the GPS on, not because I trust it completely, but because if that distance starts bouncing again, I want to know. I note mile markers more carefully, and when fog rolls through the pines and my beams catch something unexpected, I'm careful about how I look at it. I don't slam the brakes for every shadow, but I don't ignore the ones that come back around either. If you find yourself heading up the beeline toward Payson after a late shift, eyes gritty, mind half on whatever you just left behind in the valley, and you round a curve to find an overturned SUV sprawled across half your lane with its hazards blinking in impossible silence, do what you have to do to stay alive in that moment. Slow down, steer around, call it in. But if a few miles later you meet the same wreck again and again, ask yourself whether you're just tired or whether the road is showing you something that isn't meant for the morning traffic. Either way, don't assume you're entitled to get home on autopilot. Some nights the highway wants you wide awake. My name is Sophie, and if you've never hauled a reefer down State Route 79 after midnight, you might think a straight desert highway is about as simple as driving gets. Out there between Florence and Oracle Junction, with the Penal Pioneer Parkway stretching ahead in a pale ribbon and nothing but saguaros and low hills on either side, it can feel almost peaceful if you don't know what to listen for. I've been running nights for years, and I can tell you this much. A quiet road is fine. A road that sounds busy when you're the only visible set of headlights is something else entirely. That was the difference on the night I realized the convoy pacing me wasn't on any map and didn't belong to any company still operating a DOT number. It was just after midnight, dry and windy, the kind of cool desert wind that shoves at the side of your trailer in steady gusts but never quite feels like a storm. I'd picked up a refrigerated load south of Phoenix, produce bound for Tucson by morning, and my dispatcher had sent me down the back way, SR 79 instead of I-10, because of construction and some mess on the interstate. I didn't mind. I've always liked that stretch for the lack of billboards, and the way the stars seemed to ride right on top of the roadway. The reefer unit pulsed quietly behind me, holding temp. A constant low thrum I'm so used to, I only notice it when it stops. Cruise control was set a hair under the limit. My logs were clean, fuel was good. The dash glowed a calm, familiar green around me. It should have been one of those forgettable runs that blur into every other night drive. For the first half hour, it was. The first thing that felt off was the wind noise. There's a particular set of tones you get in the cab when it's just you in the air. Whistle at one seam, low roar against the mirrors, an occasional rattle from something in the sleeper. Halfway down that long, straight run, a different sound slid in under it. A distant, steady hum, like other engines idling somewhere nearby. I checked my mirrors automatically. The glass showed the usual, empty road behind. My trailer lights washing a little red over the pavement. The ghost of my own markers stretching away. No headlights. No glints off chrome. Nothing. Up ahead, where the darkness started to gray out at the horizon, I saw twin pinpricks of light. Then more. Headlights, several sets, spaced apart like the front of a small convoy. From the way they hovered low and tight in my lane and the next, my brain sorted them into shapes. A car, a tractor, another, maybe a third. I've ridden in and around enough real convoys to know the pattern, distance, rhythm, the way they eat up road from behind. These didn't behave quite right. They held position, small and distant, never flaring larger the way another rig's lamps do as it crawls up on your bumper. I watched them in the mirror for a solid 5 minutes, waiting for that inevitable slow gain. My speed was steady. The road was flat. There was no reason they should be matching me so perfectly, unless their drivers were playing some very precise game. I toggled the CB out of habit, half expecting some chatter if a group of drivers had decided to stack up on this lonely stretch for company. Any southbound traffic on 79 behind a reefer, "You got eyes on me?" I asked, voice calm. The speaker hissed back at me, then coughed up a couple of disjointed syllables from someone a long way off talking about weather near Globe. "No one local." "No. Yeah, I'm on your back door." No jokes about my slow pace. Just enough static to remind me the radio worked. If this had been my first year on nights, I might have written it off as nothing, but you learn to triangulate with more than just your eyes. I cracked my side window an inch and let the wind claw its way into the cab. With the reefer humming and my own engine working, any outside engine noise has to be loud to cut through. It was. Underneath my own truck's song, I could hear them. Multiple sets of tires on pavement, the slightly offbeat growl of different diesel engines, the clunk of a trailer hitting a joint in the road. The sound didn't line up with what I saw. It sounded closer than those tiny headlights looked, like a line of metal and rubber was running side by side with me on a strip of asphalt that didn't exist. I told myself it was just the way sound travels across open desert at night. It can do tricks, bounce off low hills, ride temperature layers. I focused on what I could measure. Tack steady, speed holding, no buffeting that would hint at a big rig right beside my trailer. My mirrors kept showing nothing but my own red glow. Up ahead, the stars shone so hard they almost hurt to look at. Off to the right and left, the desert rolled away, low and thorny, empty of light. Pinal Pioneer Parkway has a few unofficial landmarks drivers know. A certain rest area, a dip where water likes to sit after rare rains, a cluster of roadside memorial crosses that comes up out of nowhere. That night, as those white wooden markers started reflecting in my high beams, the sea beak crackled with a different kind of noise. It wasn't clear language at first, more like a handful of channels laid on top of each other. Snatches of numbers, breaths, someone laughing too hard or crying, it was hard to tell. I reached for the volume, ready to dial it back, when the chaos lined up for a second into something like a call. Mile 73 southbound. Can't get him to answer. 02:15 hours. Rollover. Negative response. 81 copy. The hair on my forearms rose, a tight prickling under the fabric of my shirt. Those weren't current calls. I know the cadence of live traffic and the clip tone dispatchers use when they're actively directing units. These sounded like recordings. More than that, the times being mumbled didn't match the minute on my dash clock. Old incidents, stuffed into a blender and spat back out. I twisted the squelch, cycled to another channel. The voices followed, faint but insistent, like they were baked into the hardware instead of riding the airwaves. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught more detail in the phantom convoy pacing me. It had drawn closer, not by shrinking the distance in my mirrors, but by revealing more of itself. To my left, in the near darkness beyond the shoulder, a ghost road seemed to run parallel to mine. A track of just barely there gray, lit not by my beams, but by some memory of headlights that weren't physically present. On that track, shapes rode the edge of visibility. A tractor with a long-nosed cab, roofline crumpled in a way that would have totaled it in any real crash, yet it rolled smooth as if nothing were wrong. A day cab with no trailer, front end shoved back toward the windshield, still pacing me. A low car with only one headlight, the other a dark socket, matching my speed like it was welded to my flank. I forced myself not to turn my head fully, keeping them in the fringe of my vision. Looking straight at them felt like an invitation. I've seen wrecks in daylight, the aftermath scattered along the shoulders of more highways than I want to count. This had that same weight, but unmoored from an actual scene. It was like driving next to every bad outcome this stretch of road had stacked up over the years, all at once. The instinct, when you find yourself surrounded by something you don't understand, is to get out of its way. Trucks are no different from prey animals in that sense. I flicked on my right blinker, scanned the lane ahead and behind, still clear, clean as if no human had used it all night, and eased onto a wide patch of dirt shoulder I knew was coming up. It was one of the few places along that run where you can pull all the way off without your trailer hanging into the lane. The gravel crunched under my tires as I brought the rig down from highway speed to a patient crawl, then a stop. The engine ticked, idling. The reefer throbbed. My hazard lights began their metronome blink, washing the roadside brush in intermittent amber. The ghost engines didn't fade. If anything, now that I was stationary, I could hear them more clearly. They rolled past on both sides, too close, too numerous for a road that, to my eyes, remained black and empty. Air brakes hissed. A Jake brake rattled down a gear somewhere above the cab. Something heavy thumped like a trailer riding over a bridge seam. My mirrors reflected only my own rig and the faint quarter-mile glow of my hazard flashes, catching nothing else. No beams streaked by. No wind shear buffeted the side of my box as a 40-ton neighbor blew past. Just sound, layered upon sound, like I was parked in the breakdown lane of a freeway only the dead used. The CB crackle shifted again, coalescing into one clear transmission that didn't belong on any current log. Southbound, Penal Parkway, we've got multiple vehicles. No survivors. Mark the mile. Mark. The voice broke up, dissolved back into a slurry of half-words and numbers. I sat there, hands locked on the wheel, feeling very small in a very large, invisible stream of highway history. Eventually, the noise began to thin. The invisible traffic moved on wherever it was going. The pressure in the air eased. The cab felt like itself again. Out the windshield, the stars seemed to regain individual sharpness instead of being a single glare. My hazards kept blinking their patient pattern. I realized my mouth was dry. I took a sip from the travel mug in the holder, the coffee inside gone lukewarm and bitter, and felt it burn a path down my throat. I could have waited there until dawn, let the sky lighten and the desert turn back into the familiar postcard version everyone recognizes. But the load in my trailer didn't care about ghosts or my nerves. It cared about delivery windows and temperature logs. So I did what truckers do. I noted the data as best I could, the approximate time, the rough distance from Florence, the feel of the wind, the behavior of the electronics, and I turned my signal back on, checking the lane twice before nudging my way onto the asphalt. The rest of the run to Oracle Junction was uneventful in the normal sense. No more phantom headlights, no spectral convoys on the parallel knot road. The CB settled back into its usual late-night diet of bored chatter and the occasional weather warning. By the time I hit the junction and turned toward the interstate that would take me on toward Tucson, I could almost have convinced myself I'd let fatigue and desert stories get the better of me. Almost. A week later, swapping lies and coffee at a truck stop diner, another driver mentioned SR-79. "You still take that Pioneer Parkway at night?" he asked. I shrugged. "When they route me that way." He nodded slowly, eyes going somewhere past my shoulder. "You ever run side by side with them?" I played dumb. "Who?" He gave me a look that said he knew I knew better. "The ones that don't show in your mirrors," he said. "Old wrecks, bad nights. They say the stretch keeps the noise of every crash it's ever seen. Sometimes, if you're unlucky or lucky depending on how you look at it, you fall in sync with it for a few miles." He stirred his coffee. "Best thing you can do when that happens is pull over, let 'em pass. Even if you can't see 'em, they'll feel you." I didn't tell him I'd already tried that, and the road had stayed visibly empty while the invisible rolled on. I just nodded and changed the subject. There's only so much of this you can drag into daylight before it starts to sound like you're telling campfire stories instead of reporting what happened. If you ever find yourself alone on SR-79 after midnight, stars sharp overhead, desert on both sides, and no taillights to be seen, pay attention to the sounds that don't match your mirrors. If a line of headlights appears at the edge of your vision and never seems to gain, if your CB starts naming mile markers from years that don't match the current calendar, understand you might be sharing a few miles with more traffic than the DOT can count. And if you decide to pull onto the shoulder and let a convoy you can't see roll by, don't expect proof in the form of dust trails or passing beams. Sometimes, out here, the only evidence you get that you weren't alone is the ringing in your ears once the engines fade, and the sudden, enormous quiet of a highway that remembers more than it shows. My name is Paisley, and if you'd asked me last year what scared me most about driving between Sedona and Flagstaff at night, I would have said rockfall, drunk tourists, or elk in the road, not road signs that acted like they knew my name. I'm a student in Flagstaff, and like a lot of people my age, I juggle classes with a service job. For a while, that job was in Sedona, at a restaurant that stayed open later than it should have for the kind of crowd it drew. That meant a lot of late drives back up State Route 89A through Oak Creek Canyon, climbing out of Red Rock country into the pines with my trunk full of dirty aprons and my brain full of half-remembered table orders. I always told myself the canyon was more beautiful than dangerous. You just had to respect the curves and not drive like the out-of-towners who treated every turn like a photo op. The night I stopped thinking of it as just scenic started out ordinary enough. A slow drizzle, wet pavement shining in my headlights, and a storm forecast rolling in later that I thought I could beat if I didn't waste time. I clocked out a little before 11:30, helped kill the last of the lights at the restaurant, and slid into my car already half in that strange headspace between wired and exhausted that only night shifts give you. By the time I hit the north end of town, the traffic had thinned. Sedona's glow fell behind me as a soft halo, the last gas station lights giving way to the first whispering stands of trees. The canyon road tightened quickly, the shoulders shrinking, rock walls leaning in. My high beams bounced off wet sandstone and dripping vegetation, turning every bend into a flash photograph of slick stone and black water. The drizzle wasn't heavy enough to kill visibility, just enough to make the wipers work for their keep and lay a sheen over the asphalt. Down to my right, somewhere unseen but always present, Oak Creek murmured its way over rocks. When you drive that road enough, you learn its rhythm. The long, flowing sections where you can exhale a little, the tight switchbacks where the drop gets uncomfortably close, the pullouts and trailheads that look like safe havens in daylight and like mouths in the dark. Rehook or not, this is the part I can't explain with fatigue or weather. The road signs started talking to me, and not in any language the highway department ever approved. It started with a small green sign on the shoulder I would swear wasn't there the week before. The metal looked new, the reflective letters crisp under my headlights. It pointed down a narrow paved turnoff I knew led to a popular overlook during the day, but the words on it were wrong. Scenic overlook, midnight access only. I almost laughed when I read it. It felt like some weird local tourism gimmick, like a haunted attraction trying a little too hard. Midnight access only. It was just after 12 by then. My dash clock clicked from 12:03 to 12:04 as I rolled past. For half a second, my hands almost twitched toward the indicator. The rain had eased to a mist, and the idea of being the only person at a viewpoint over the canyon with a sky full of stars above had its appeal. Then a cold little thought needled its way in. I had never seen that wording on any official sign, and I drove this road at least twice a week. I told myself the parks people were experimenting with limiting traffic at certain hours, that I'd missed some notice on the news. I stayed in my lane. The GPS on my dash blandly showed the main road curling ahead, as it always did, no new side destinations popping up. 5 minutes later, the canyon tightened, and I dropped my speed for another series of bends. A low patch of fog had drifted up from the creek, pooling in the low spots and making the beams smear. As I crept around one particularly sharp left-hander, my headlights picked up another sign. Same size, same green, same fresh paint look. But this one didn't point to a turnoff. It was planted right at the edge of the lane, arrow bent indecisively as if it couldn't quite decide which way to point, and the text made my stomach dip. Last exit before loop, it said. Nothing else. No mileage, no source, no reassuring little shield logo. I know that road. There is no loop. You commit to the climb or you don't. There isn't some secret circular bypass they only tell certain drivers about. I slowed instinctively, heart tapping a little faster, the weak pull of gravity behind me now joined by a stronger pull of unease. The GPS still showed nothing unusual. The thin blue line traced up the canyon, the estimated arrival time in Flagstaff stubbornly refusing to move much despite the weather. My rational brain grabbed for explanations. Prank, hallucination, weird art project. My spooked brain reminded me that there aren't many places in that canyon where someone can just wander out and plant a sign without attracting attention during the day. The next few miles blurred into a pattern I didn't recognize, but my body did. Each time I thought I'd cleared a familiar segment, something about the road felt slightly off. A curve that should have opened onto a particular rock formation instead revealed another anonymous bend. A set of mile markers repeated when they shouldn't have. I passed one, MP 386, then a few minutes later, passed 386 again. The first time, I thought I'd misread in the rain. The second time, I actually said no way out loud to the empty car. The GPS map, when I dared look down at it on a straight short enough to risk a glance, showed my location bouncing backward by a notch, or freezing entirely while the physical road kept unwinding. That's when the red Subaru joined the story. I first noticed it in my rear view, a mid-2000s hatchback, boxy, with one headlight a little dimmer than the other, hugging the curves more aggressively than I liked. It tucked close enough behind me that I could make out the shape of something hanging from its rearview mirror, swinging slightly with each bend. I'm not a timid driver, but I'm not stupid either. On slick canyon roads, you don't play braking games. I eased up when I had a clear line of sight, and eventually the Subaru took the hint, pulled out just enough on a straighter section, and slid past. As it did, I glanced over. The cabin was lit by the soft glow of its dash. The driver's profile was there. A man, maybe, or a woman with hair pulled back. Hard to tell in that flash. I noticed their hands tight on the wheel, eyes locked ahead, and then they were gone, taillights blurring red as they swung into the next curve and out of view. 2 bends later, on a different alignment of road that shouldn't have allowed it, the same red Subaru slid into my rear view again. For a few beats, my tired brain tried to insist it was a different car, but the details stacked up. Same hanging thing from the mirror, same chip paint on the left rear quarter panel I hadn't even registered consciously the first time. Same slightly misaligned headlight beam pattern. They tucked in behind me a little too close once more. Then, when the lane opened enough, swung out to pass. This time, when my side window framed their cabin, I saw more. The driver's face was turned just enough that my headlights spilled across it. The skin looked wrong. Not bloody, not obviously injured, just slack, like someone who had been exhausted for far too long. The eyes seemed unfocused, not tracking the road, yet the hands held the car perfectly on line. As the Subaru eased ahead, a cold, sour taste crept up the back of my throat. I let more distance build between us, riding my brake gently on the downslopes, nursing the gas on the ups. The drizzle picked up again, dots on the windshield fattening into streaks. Somewhere below, the creek's noise grew louder for a moment, then faded as the canyon shifted. My phone, sitting in its little mount, winked in and out of signal, the tiny icon flipping between LTE and no service, like it couldn't make up its mind. For a brief few minutes, my rational mind won. I told myself I'd misjudged, that curves and elevation can do weird things with where cars appear relative to each other. I focused on the wet road, the next sign, the comforting monotony of the wiper's rhythm. Then I passed the scenic overlook midnight access only sign again. Same spot, same angle, same unnervingly clean lettering. The clock on my dash now read 12:27 a.m. Somehow, in the mess of fog and repetition, I'd circled back to whatever point on the climb that sign anchored, even though the road, at least in my sensory memory, had never offered a turn wide enough to loop me. I didn't see the Subaru in the mirror at that moment, and a tiny piece of my tension melted. Maybe it had found an exit I hadn't. Maybe it was out of the loop, whatever that loop was. Rehook, because this is when it stopped feeling like a bad dream and started feeling personal. The third time I saw the red Subaru, it didn't come from behind. It came at me from ahead, on my side of the road, and the person driving it was no longer just tired. They looked like they'd lost a fight with the canyon and somehow kept going. The curve leading into that encounter was a long, sweeping right that usually gives you a brief, stunning view of the canyon if you're foolish enough to take your eyes off the pavement. That night, the fog clung low, hiding whatever beauty the dark was keeping. My high beams traced the guardrail, then caught moving light. 2 headlights weaving their way toward me, a little too centered in the lane. I eased over, dropping a touch of speed. The oncoming car's shape resolved as it came closer. Even through rain and reflection, I recognized the outline of the Subaru's front end, the pattern of its lights. My brain tried to juggle the math. It had been behind me just minutes ago, then ahead, now somehow coming toward me on a stretch of road that didn't intersect with any junctions that would have allowed that kind of repositioning. As it closed the last few dozen yards, my beams washed fully over its front. The windshield was cracked now, a jagged arc running from the top corner down toward the center. Behind the glass, the driver's face was a ruined echo of what I'd glimpsed earlier. The skin sagged in unnatural ways, pallor fighting with dark bruising that bloomed under one eye. The mouth was slightly open, lips slack. But the eyes, that was what rooted me to the wheel. They were fixed dead ahead, not flinching at my lights, not reacting to the conditions, just locked onto some midpoint that happened to be exactly where my car was. There was a brief, sickening instant where it felt less like we were 2 vehicles sharing a road, and more like we were films being projected through each other, collision already baked into the frames. I jerked the wheel right, tires hissing protest on the wet surface, heart in my throat. The Subaru never altered its course. It passed through the place my car had just been with impossible precision. Then, in the mirror, simply wasn't there. No red taillights, no spray of water kicked up by tires, no fading Doppler of an engine. Just the canyon, the rain, my own ragged breathing. At that point, every instinct screamed that I needed to get off that road, any road, find a turnout, and sit until the world made sense again. But each time I passed what looked like a pull-off, the signs by it were wrong. Detour, local traffic only, pointing down what I knew for a fact was a dead-end hiking access. Alternate route to Flagstaff, authorized drivers, with an arrow that seemed to point straight into the creek. The GPS, when I looked at it again, displayed a route that spiraled on itself like a child's drawing. The usual clean line replaced by knots and doubled back sections. That made no geographic sense. The estimated time of arrival pulsed between 2 numbers, 28 minutes, 52 minutes, 28 again, as if it were arguing with itself. The loop broke not because I outsmarted it, but because I finally did the opposite of everything my navigation systems were telling me. There's a particular retaining wall in the canyon, a tall, curved structure of stacked rock with a tiny pull-off just before it, that I used as a mental marker for being about 2/3 of the way through the climb. When I came around a bend and saw that wall for what felt like the second time in an hour, something in me snapped. I turned the volume on my phone down until the GPS voice was a faint mumble, then muted it altogether. As another small, too clean sign loomed ahead, reading "Last exit before loop" in accusing letters, I did the one thing it didn't suggest. I stayed hard against the canyon wall, eyes on the yellow center line, ignoring every arrow that wanted me to drift. The drizzle thickened into real rain. Water began to snake down the rock faces in thin streams, splashing onto the pavement in random patterns. My wipers slapped a little harder. The Subaru didn't show up again. Not behind, not ahead, not hovering at the edge of my vision. The mile markers, when they appeared, finally advanced in order instead of repeating 387, 388, 389. The GPS screen, when I risked a glance, flickered once, then redrew itself with a normal, sensible path up the canyon, the distance and time adjusting to something that lined up with my gut. There were no more strange signs, only the worn, familiar ones. Slow vehicles use turnouts, falling rock, the usual admonitions to buckle up and not text. And then, so suddenly it made my eyes sting, city light bloomed ahead. Not the soft tourist glow of Sedona this time, but the colder, flatter spread of Flagstaff's south side. I crested the last hill, merged with a couple of other late-night drivers who had come up from I-17 and spilled out onto wider, straighter roads that smelled like wet asphalt and fast food instead of wet stone and whatever old things the canyon keeps. The clock on my dash told me the entire ordeal had lasted maybe 45 minutes longer than it should have. My body said otherwise. My hands ached like I'd been clenching the wheel for hours. When I finally parked in front of my apartment and shut off the engine, the silence in the car felt like stepping out of a crowded room. I checked the road reports the next day, half expecting to see mention of a crash, a closure, anything to tag on to the red Subaru or the looping signs. There was nothing. No overnight incidents on 89A, no alerts. Friends I mentioned it to later chalked it up to stress, to the way a mind already primed by spooky canyon stories can turn a long, wet drive into a horror reel. Maybe they're right. But here's the part that keeps me from writing it off completely. A couple weeks later, I overheard two older locals at a coffee shop trading canyon war stories the way people do. One of them said, "You ever get caught in the loop?" The other rolled his eyes. "Yeah. Signs start telling you things that ain't on any map. Only way out is to stop listening." They laughed, but it landed wrong. Since that night, I still take 89A sometimes. Old habits and tight budgets mean I don't always have the luxury of the interstate detour, but I run it earlier when I can. I keep a closer eye on the real mile markers and a much more suspicious one on any sign that looks too new, too specific, or too eager to offer me a shortcut only for midnight access. And if I ever see that red Subaru again in my mirror, or coming around a bend with a driver whose face doesn't look like it belongs on this side of the canyon, I already know my plan. Ignore the voices, real or digital, keep my tires on the known lines, and remember that not every destination that announces itself deserves to be reached. My name is Ruby, and if you've ever tried to move your whole life in one night, you know there's a special kind of tired that comes from watching the glow of one city fade in the rear view, while the idea of a new one is still just a promise somewhere up the highway. That's where I was the night the interstate decided to show me a version of my own family that might not have made it. We were heading north on I-17 between Black Canyon City and Camp Verde, that stretch where the road drops and climbs through real mountains instead of the gentle hills people picture when they hear Arizona. It was late enough that the kids had finally crashed in their seats. The boxes were wedged in every free gap of the SUV, and my husband was following in a rented moving truck a few car lengths behind, his headlights a steady presence in my mirrors. It should have been simple. Hold a safe speed down the grades, keep an eye on the weather, don't miss the turnoffs. Instead, with the rain turning to mist and the lanes slick and dark, I ended up being shadowed by us. The storm had broken earlier south of Anthem, a proper desert downpour that made the wipers work double time and turned the shoulders into shallow rivers for a while. By the time we hit the steeper parts of the climb, it had eased into something stranger, a fine, clinging drizzle near the lower elevations that thinned into pockets of mist as we gained altitude. The air coming through the vents felt colder, sharper, and the difference in pressure between the valley and the higher country made my ears pop now and then. I'd kicked the transmission down a gear for the long downhill segments, engine braking instead of riding the pedal, the way every local will tell you to do it if you don't want to burn your brakes. The taillights in my mirrors, my husband's truck, rose and fell with the grade in a predictable rhythm. Every few minutes, I'd glance up just to reassure myself he was still there, that we were still a two-vehicle caravan, and not just me and two sleeping kids in a box of metal and glass. Traffic was light but not empty. A few semis growled past in the left lane, their marker lights strung along the trailers like moving constellations. Every now and then, we'd catch up to someone more cautious, follow for a while through a series of curves, then pass when it was safe. The road surface gleamed in the beams, patchy with old repairs and new stripes. The kind of wet that looks almost oily. Off to the sides, I knew there were steep drops and stands of trees, but the darkness and creeping fog hid most of it, leaving me with just the immediate task. Stay in the lane, keep the speed under control, don't overthink it. The first time I saw the other minivan, I thought it was just a weird reflection. I caught it in the rear view as a set of headlights lower and closer together than the rental trucks, tucked too neatly into the blind space between his bumper and mine. I frowned and tilted the mirror slightly, wondering when someone had cut between us. The shapes didn't quite line up with what my brain expected. The glow was softer, a little yellower, the way older halogen bulbs look compared to the whiter light on newer vehicles. Before I could adjust again for a better angle, a curve shifted the perspective, and the only lights back there were the two bright eyes of the truck, rock solid behind me. Okay, I muttered to myself. Rain ghosts. Whatever. Talking out loud has always been my way of keeping my nerves from spiraling. The kids stayed out, their breathing a soft white noise from the back seats. I could see the rise and fall of my daughter's small shoulder in the rear view when I angled it down. The outline of my son's head leaned against the window, ear pressed to the glass. I tried to let the road lull me again, counting down the distance to the next known exit in my head, using the green signs as checkpoints to break the trip into smaller chunks. Rehook if you need one. It's one thing to worry about other drivers on a mountain interstate in bad weather. It's another to realize the vehicle you're most afraid of hitting is a version of your own, moving in ways you aren't choosing. The second time the duplicate showed up, it was harder to explain away. We were in one of those long downhill stretches where the lanes bend gently, hugging the side of a ridge. I was riding the right lane, speed a notch under the limit because of the slick surface, hands at 10 and 2, muscles tight from the concentration. The truck was exactly where it should be in the mirror. Then, as a patch of thicker fog rolled over the road, a second set of headlights slid into view behind me, perfectly aligned with the tailgate of my SUV. For a few seconds, the mirror showed 3 light sources stacked. A tall pair from the truck, a lower pair that matched the height of my own, and, beyond them, nothing but dark. I checked my side mirror, expecting to see someone hugging my bumper improperly. It reflected only the silver grille of the rental truck and a smear of road. When I looked back at the center mirror, the extra lights were gone. The fog thinned, the truck's beam stood alone again. I felt a prickle buzz up from my fingertips into my forearms, like static. My first instinct was to chalk it up to the way light bounces in mist, how droplets can create phantom halos. But there was a sharpness to the image that didn't fit with that excuse. The lower headlights had looked too solid, too deliberate. I tried to shake it off. This was not the road for getting lost in your head. I focused on sensible, actionable things, checked my following distance, glanced at the gauges, adjusted the defrost. Somewhere between Black Canyon City and Sunset Point, the rain picked up for a spell, beating harder on the windshield, then eased again, leaving behind thicker banks of fog that clung to the cut slopes and drifted across the lanes in slow sheets. The outside world reduced itself to a gray bubble about as wide as my beams, the rest erased. Inside the car, it was just dashboard glow, the faint smell of fast food we'd eaten hours earlier, and the occasional sleepy murmur from the back. It wasn't until the third appearance that I saw more than just lights. We'd just come through a series of curves with warning signs, yellow diamonds flashing their little squiggle icons and suggested lower speeds. The road straightened for a brief stretch, enough that I let my shoulders drop a fraction and loosen my grip. In that moment, in the glass, a full minivan slid into view behind us. Same color as mine, same general shape, Same stick figure family decal on the left side of the back window, the one I'd always been a little embarrassed about, but had never gotten around to scraping off. My breath hitched. For a couple of terrifying seconds, the back of my own vehicle was there twice in front of me. Once in reality, as the inside of a tailgate I could reach back and touch, and once in the reflection, as a complete duplicate occupying the same lane space just beyond my husband's truck. I told myself there was some trick at play, that maybe I was seeing the reflection of my own taillights bounced off a wet median or some weird alignment through the truck's mirrors. I started scanning for hard evidence. I flipped the rear wiper once, clearing beads of water from the back glass. In that single swipe, the view sharpened, and I saw something I hadn't wanted to see. Silhouettes. Two small dark shapes sat where my kids would sit. The contours of their heads, the slope of their shoulders, the suggestion of seatbelts bisecting their chests. They were absolutely still. No telltale loll of the head with sleep, no twitch of an arm, no fidget the way even dozing children make unconsciously. Just fixed, upright forms, like cutouts pressed against the glass. My daughter, in reality, was slumped sideways in her booster, blankie half pulled over her. My son had kicked one sock off ages ago. In the mirror version, the silhouettes might as well have been mannequins. Every time I eased off the gas or tapped the brake, the duplicate adjusted in perfect sync. If I signaled and drifted half a lane left to pass a slow vehicle, it did too. Its motion a beat-for-beat echo held at a precise distance. The rental truck's lights stayed behind both, like he was following a small convoy instead of just his family. I didn't dare get on the radio and ask him if he saw anything. The last thing I wanted was to panic him on that grade. Instead, I kept stealing glances, trying to catch the duplicate doing something out of pattern. It never did. At some point, the copy stopped trailing and started leading. One instant, the reflection showed that wrong extra set of lamps behind me. The next, as I blinked and glanced back at the road, my headlights picked out a minivan's rear end ahead of me instead. Same bumper stickers, same tiny chipped corner in one taillight I recognized with a jolt of familiarity. For a second, I thought I'd caught up with another family with the same make and model, someone who just happened to be moving their life north on the same night, decorated the same way. Then the reality of that probability hammered against the memory of those frozen silhouettes, and the hair on my arms bristled. The rain had gone back to mist by then, hanging over the lane like breath. The pavement shone a uniform dark, lines reflecting cleanly. There was no exit between the last time I'd seen my husband's truck directly behind me and this new arrangement. The only way a minivan could be in front with that exact configuration was if it had either overtaken us invisible or it was not obeying the same geometry as everything else on the highway. The other us held a steady pace, matching my speed like it had before from the rear. When I dropped a few miles per hour, its taillights dimmed in the same proportional way and kept the distance. When I crept a little closer, out of some perverse urge to see if I could read its plate, it seemed to stretch the space back out without noticeably accelerating. The kids shifted in their real seats, some half-dream moan escaping my daughter's lips. In the copy's back window, the silhouettes never moved. Rehook again in the middle because this is the part that lodged deepest. In that longer stretch of downhill, with mist hugging the lane and 3 lanes narrowing back to 2, it felt less like we were following another vehicle and more like we were watching a replay of ourselves from some angle slightly to the side of real time. The lines of the road lined up. The stickers were in exactly the right places. But there was a heaviness in the way the duplicate sat in the lane, a sense of weight and inevitability, like a scene already decided. The moment broke when the world did one of those abrupt physical shifts weather can do in the mountains. We dipped into a lower pocket, and the fog peeled away as if someone had drawn a line in the air. 1 second, white tunnel. The next, clear visibility out much farther. Stars pricked faintly above the black cut of the hills. In that same second, the traffic around us snapped back into ordinary logic. The minivan ahead was gone. A box truck rumbled a safe distance in the left lane, and directly in my rear view, there was only the familiar, slightly higher pair of headlights belonging to the rental truck. No extra glow, no strange echoes. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My shoulders slumped, adrenaline leaking out, leaving behind that shaky, exhausted feeling you get after you come down from a scare. From the back seat came a soft voice, slurred with sleep. "Mom," my daughter mumbled. "Yeah, honey," I said, trying to sound normal. "We're still driving. Go back to sleep." There was a pause, the kind that feels too long in the middle of the night. "Why were we watching ourselves crash?" she asked, the words mangled slightly, but clear enough, like she was describing something obvious from a dream she was still half in. Before I could form a response, she let out a small sob and started crying, the kind of bewildered tears kids have when they wake up unsettled. I reached one hand back, palm open, until she grabbed my fingers, and drove the rest of that grade like my life depended on keeping the wheel perfectly straight. By the time we rolled into the relative calm of the Camp Verde area, the weather had stabilized. The mist stayed up on the higher slopes. The rain downgraded to occasional drops. We pulled into a gas station off the exit to regroup, top off, and check the tie-downs on the truck. Under the harsh white canopy lights, with the smell of fuel and the hum of refrigerators around us, my husband looked fine. Tired, but fine. When I asked if he'd seen any strange minivans weaving in and out near us, he frowned. "Just you," he said, "and a couple of semis." "Why?" I almost told him. Instead, I shook my head and blamed it on the weather, the kids, the stress of the move. Later, when everything was unloaded and the new house smelled like cardboard and cleaning products instead of hours, I lay awake longer than I should have, replaying the drive. The extra reflections, the silhouettes that didn't move, my daughter's words. There are practical explanations you can slap over pieces of it. Light refraction in fog, mirror ghosts, a child's bad dream lining up coincidentally with a parent's anxiety. I'm not hostile to those. I'd like to sleep eventually. But there's a stubborn corner of my mind that keeps circling something else. That the I-17 between Black Canyon City and Camp Verde has seen more late-night accidents than any of us want to count. That those long grades and bad weather have taken families who thought they were just going home. And that maybe, on certain nights, the line between made it and didn't gets thin enough that you can see across for a moment. If you ever find yourself shepherding your own little convoy up or down that stretch in the dark, especially in mist that makes the guardrails look like they're floating, keep an eye on your mirrors, but don't let them own your attention. And if you glimpse your own taillights where they shouldn't be, with your own stickers and your own cargo matching you too perfectly, ask yourself a quiet question. Is that a warning of what could happen, or the shadow of something that already did, sliding alongside for a mile or two before peeling off into its own exit you'll never see? Either way, keep your hands steady, trust the real weight of the wheel, and remember which vehicle you're actually in. My name is Claire, and I used to think the creepiest part of a night shift was the silence that settles over an ER around 3 in the morning, when the drunks have either sobered up or passed out, and the early commuters haven't started crashing their cars yet. That was before I realized some of our regulars never actually left the highway that brought them in. I work nights at a hospital in the East Valley, which means most of my commutes home start the same way. I pull out of the parking structure with my scrub sticking to my skin, my brain buzzing from too much caffeine and not enough sleep, and I point my old sedan east toward US 60, the Superstition Freeway. The city feels almost gentle at that hour. The orange halo over Mesa hangs low. Billboards cycle through their ads for injury lawyers and mattress sales, and the lane lines slide under your tires in a way that can almost lull you if you're not careful. Past a certain point, though, the metro lights start to thin, and the black bulk of the Superstition Mountains rises off to the right, eating starlight and turning the freeway into a kind of corridor between two worlds, suburb and desert, routine and whatever waits out there beyond the street lamps. This night, I just finished one of those shifts that feels like a month. We'd lost a guy on the table an hour before I clocked out. Single vehicle rollover somewhere out toward Apache Junction. Driver brought in full trauma, never regained a pulse. On top of a dozen smaller crises, it left my nerves raw. I told myself the drive would help me come down. The freeway wasn't busy, not for a weeknight just after midnight. A few trucks, a handful of cars, nothing like the rush hours when everyone is jockeying for space. I slipped into the second lane from the right, set my speed a notch over the limit, and let the familiar rhythm take over. The hospital receded in my rear view, replaced by exit signs and the distant glow of subdivisions. Off to my right, every few miles, the silhouette of the Superstitions would loom up beyond the low buildings, then fade again, a jagged black horizon that never quite left the corner of my vision. I first saw him near one of those spots where the freeway median narrows down to that skinny strip of concrete and gravel between opposing lanes. He was just there, suddenly caught in the wash of my headlights. A man standing dead still on the median, close enough to the fast lane that any stumble would have put him in traffic. He wore what looked like dark work pants and a button-down shirt, sleeves rolled to the forearms, the kind of outfit you see on mechanics or warehouse guys who've taken off their reflective vests but not changed. No reflective gear, no bag, no phone glow in his hands. His posture was the thing that made my skin tighten. Arms at his sides, feet planted, body facing the oncoming eastbound lanes, but his head turned toward mine, angled just enough that I could see the line of his jaw, the suggestion of eyes. I did what any sane person would do at that hour. I checked the shoulder for a safe place to pull over in case he stepped into the road, and I grabbed for my phone to have it ready if I needed to call someone. By the time my car drew level, the concrete barrier between us blocked most of my view. In the few seconds I had, I tried to pick out details, a logo on the shirt, the age in his face, anything that would tell me whether I was looking at a drunk, a stranded driver, or something worse. The headlights washed over him and moved on. In my rear view, I expected to see his back as I passed, that odd, upright silhouette receding between the streams of light. Instead, the median where he'd been was empty, just low barrier, gravel, scrub. My first thought was that I'd misjudged the distance. The canyon of lights at night can play tricks. Maybe he'd been farther back than I thought, at a previous gap in the barrier. Maybe he'd stepped down into the shadow as I passed. I told myself all of that in the 20 or 30 seconds it took for my heart rate to settle a little. The road ahead unfurled, exit signs ticking past, Val Vista, power, then further toward that thinning edge where the last serious clusters of lights give way to darker stretches. I flipped the radio on low, more for company than anything, letting some late-night host's voice murmur over the hum of the tires. A few miles later, near another of those narrow median sections, I saw him again. Same stance, same clothes, same eerie stillness. He was standing in the next break in the barrier, this time a little farther up from where the concrete tapered into open gravel, but positioned almost identically relative to the lanes. The freeway still wasn't busy. A couple of headlights smeared on the opposite side, nothing in front of me for a good distance. As my car approached, my stomach knotted. The odds of two different men in the same outfit, standing the same way in the same dangerous spot, within a short stretch of the same highway, were low enough that my rational brain started to lose confidence. I slowed a little, enough that the cars behind me, if there had been any, might have wondered what I was doing, and let my eyes track him as long as they could. Again, his body faced the flow of traffic, but his head was turned just off angle toward my lane. His face wasn't grotesque or obviously injured. It was ordinary in that way you forget as soon as you look away. Thinning hair, strong nose, maybe lines around the mouth. Middle-aged if I had to guess. No wild eyes, no mouth moving in a shout I couldn't hear. Just this disconcerting focus, like he was watching for something only he would recognize when it arrived. When I checked my mirror after passing, he was where he shouldn't have been. Not behind me at the same opening, not disappearing into darkness. He was suddenly standing in the next gap up the median, still ahead of me, same posture, same turn of the head, as if my passing him had simply jumped him forward a notch, without any time passing in between. For a few seconds, the geometry in my head broke. The freeway is straightforward here. Lanes, median, lanes. There's no side road that would allow someone to sprint ahead unseen, no trick of reflection that would project an image forward like that. And yet, there he was, caught again at the edge of my high beams. Rehook in the middle, because this is where it stopped being just a weird roadside sighting and turned into something that followed me home. It wasn't until I was back in the ER, hours later, flipping through old trauma records to occupy my mind, that I realized I already knew his face. The rest of the drive home that night was a blur of tension. I kept expecting to see him at every break in the median. This fixed point my car would slide past again and again until the world lost track of which lap we were on. After the third time he appeared ahead of me like that, still watchful, never growing larger or smaller in the way normal perspective demands, I stopped glancing at the rear view for a while. It felt like an invitation. I focused on pragmatic tasks, checking my speed, scanning for genuinely immediate dangers like weaving drivers or debris, watching for the subtle shift when the freeway straightened out and the exit for my neighborhood crept close. By the time I rolled into my driveway, the sky over the Superstitions had gone from pure black to that faint gray you get just before dawn starts to think about arriving. My hands shook a little on the steering wheel. I told myself I was overwrought, seeing patterns where there were none because of the trauma earlier in the night. I showered, lay down, and managed a few hours of restless sleep before my next shift. The hospital had its own shadows waiting for me that evening. Between patients, when the flow dipped just enough that my mind started to drift back to the man on the median, I found myself in the records room, a cramped, fluorescent-lit space we still use for older files that haven't been fully digitized. Some habits die hard. Even with electronic medical records, there are paper charts dating back decades in there, stacked in boxes and crammed into rolling shelves with handwritten labels. I went in on the pretense of looking up something for a regular chronic case, but my feet took me toward the trauma section instead. It wasn't a clear plan at first. I just had this nagging need to prove to myself that what I'd seen belonged to some catalog of the explainable. Maybe I'd seen the man before, at triage or in a hallway, and my brain had pasted him onto the freeway median because of stress. Faces have a way of floating around like that. I started pulling older trauma binders at random, the ones tagged with US 60 accidents from years past, flipping through black and white photocopies of intake sheets and the occasional, grainy driver's license scan stapled to a chart. The first time I saw him in those pages, my heart gave a little stutter. It wasn't a perfect photograph. Time and bad copying had bleached out a lot of detail, but the shape of the head, the line of the jaw, the way the eyes seemed a little too deep set in the socket, it all lined up uncomfortably well with the snapshot my headlights had burned into my memory. The chart was dated years before I ever moved to Arizona, before I'd even started nursing school. Single vehicle collision eastbound on US 60 near Apache Junction. Middle-aged male, pronounced dead on arrival. The narrative section mentioned witnesses seeing a man standing on the median moments before he stepped or fell into traffic. The time of death had been recorded at 12:17 a.m. I told myself it was coincidence. A lot of men in this area dress in work shirts and slacks. Memory is unreliable. I put the chart back, grabbed another at random, one from a different year. Same highway, another fatal collision in roughly the same corridor. Different circumstances this time, multi-car pileup in bad weather, but when I found the victim's photo, that same generic yet specific face stared up at me. Maybe a little younger, maybe the hairline a touch fuller. But the core was there. The more I looked, the less I could convince myself I was just projecting. I started scanning years, the 90s, early 2000s. A sheet from before the Superstition Freeway had been fully upgraded from its older configurations. Again and again, in the pile of tragedies that US 60 has delivered to our doors, that face resurfaced. Sometimes attached to a driver, sometimes to a pedestrian, once to a possible hitchhiker struck in lane 3. The times varied, but a pattern emerged. Many were logged just after midnight. One file in particular hit me wrong. The timestamp on the EMS report read 2:14. The recorded time of incident, estimated by the first officer on scene, was 2:10. My drive home the night before. I'd glanced at my clock just as I'd seen the man the first time. 12:10 a.m. I stood there in that cramped room, the hum of the air conditioner loud in my ears, and felt a thin layer of the world peel back. It would have been easy, in that moment, to shove the folders back onto the shelf and decide I was making connections out of noise. People die on that road. Of course, there will be similarities. Of course, faces blur together after long enough. But alongside the scientific clinical part of my brain that counts respiration rates and calculates drip rates, another part was whispering something simpler. Some stories don't end where you think they do. I didn't tell anyone on staff. Nurses are superstitious enough as it is. We talk about frequent flyers, patients who seem to show up every full moon, and certain rooms that make monitors act up. Bringing a possibly repeating highway ghost into that mix felt like tipping the balance too far. Instead, I paid attention on my next few commutes. For a couple of weeks, nothing out of the ordinary happened. The freeway was just a freeway again. Brake lights, lane changes, the occasional close call with somebody on their phone. The superstitions sat off to the side, dark and indifferent. Then, one night when the ER had been mercifully quiet, and I was driving home with a little less exhaustion dragging at my bones, I saw him again. Same place in the corridor, roughly. Same narrow median. Same posture. This time, instead of fighting the urge, I let my eyes track him from the moment he entered my beams until he slid out again. There was no flicker, no ghostly transparency. He looked as solid and present as any living person. The fabric of his shirt hanging with real weight, the slight shine of his shoes catching the light. As my car passed and the median wall blocked him, I forced myself to look in the rear view despite every nerve screaming not to. He wasn't behind me. He was already standing in the next gap in the barrier up ahead, the same distance away as before, as if the freeway were a film strip and he occupied multiple frames at once. The only things that changed between appearances were the faint angles of his shoulders, the set of his jaw. Once, his head was tipped a fraction higher, like he was sniffing the air. Another time, his chin dipped, and if I'd believed in that kind of thing, I might have said he was looking down at the lane, waiting. I drove on. I didn't stop. There was nothing useful I could have done for him at the side of a 70-mile-an-hour corridor, even if he'd been alive. If he wasn't, then pulling over into the dark by myself was a line I wasn't ready to cross. The next day, though, on a break, I went back into the records room and pulled the oldest US 60 folder I could find. The paper was fragile, edges yellowed. The photo clipped to the inside was grainy, a DMV shot from decades ago. The face was younger, narrower, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. The same man, caught in a moment, long before the freeway took its current shape, long before the Superstition Freeway was officially called that. The notes on that one were brief. Head-on collision near Apache Junction, poor visibility. Time of incident listed as shortly after midnight. Maybe every city has its watchers. Figures people glimpse on bridges and overpasses. Faces that start as urban legends and acquire history as they go. I'm not claiming to have solved anything or to know who he was beyond what ink on old paper says. I just know this. There's a stretch of the Superstition Freeway east of the sprawl where, if you're driving home alone a little after midnight and the mountains are a black cutout against the sky. You might see a man in work clothes standing on the median, as solid as anyone you triaged during your shift. If you do, and you're tempted to think he's just another stranded soul waiting for a ride, remember that some of us have seen his face again and again in places where the story already ended. And if you happen to be the type of person who signs off on time of death, pay attention to the clock when you pass him. You might find that the numbers line up more closely than you're comfortable with. My name is Leilani, and for most of my career, the only thing that's ever really unsettled me in the field has been the way the desert can go from endless to claustrophobic in a single missed landmark. I'm a wildlife biologist, the kind who spends more nights than days working, tracking collars, counting eyeshine, reading tracks in places most people only ever see from an airplane window. That's how I ended up alone after midnight on Navajo Route 20, out near the Painted Desert, with a thermal camera rig bolted to the dash and a notebook full of coordinates riding shotgun. I told myself this run would be like so many others. Crawl along the shoulder, stop where the data said the animals like to cross, log what moved in the dark, then crawl back to a cheap motel and sleep through the sunrise. Instead, I ended up learning what it feels like to be the one being patterned. The night was clear in that high desert way that makes the stars feel like a ceiling you could touch if you stood on the hood. No moon, just the Milky Way, smeared bright from horizon to horizon. The banded badlands around me turned into hulking shadows. The pavement of 20 cut through it all as a narrow pale stripe, its edges crumbling to gravel before dropping off into open scrub. This section had been used as a detour when US 89 had closures, so the asphalt was better than some reservation roads I've driven. But there were no lights, no reflectors beyond the occasional faded post. My truck's headlights carved out a cone of dirty yellow ahead. The thermal monitor glowed blue-black inside, my real window into what was moving out there. I rolled along at maybe 30, sometimes less, hugging the right side so I could swing off onto the shoulder when I needed to without startling anything with a last-second swerve. Most of the first hour was textbook. Coyotes slipped in and out of the thermal's field like small comets, tails low, heat signatures tight and bright. Once, a group of pronghorn appeared as a cluster of glowing ovals out on the flats, far from the road, heads coming up in unison when my engine note reached them. I logged times, locations, rough counts, noting where they crossed, where they only paralleled. The truck's cab smelled like dust and coffee, the two constants of my work life. The radio, set low, hissed and muttered as I moved out of range of one station and into the bleed of another. Nothing interesting enough to hold my attention more than the numbers on the GPS and the shapes on the screen. It changed gradually. The first time I noticed the anomaly, it was easy to blame on equipment. A large, warm shape appeared at the extreme right edge of the thermal image, a blob bigger than any coyote, taller than a deer if it were standing in the ditch. It held there, half in frame, heat-bright orange against the deep blue background. I assumed I was catching a closer-than-usual boulder, still holding on to daytime warmth, or maybe a parked vehicle just off the road outside my headlight cone. I eased off the accelerator, letting the truck slow. The blob stayed exactly where it was on the monitor. No parallax shift, no growing or shrinking. In real life, if you roll toward a fixed object, it moves across your field of view. This one seemed to be attached to my position rather than to the landscape. I nudged the wheel a few degrees left, then right. The road curved gently that way anyway, bending around some low rise. The blob slid in the opposite direction just enough to stay anchored to the same edge of the frame, like it was pacing me on a circle I couldn't see. That got my attention in a way the usual coyote blips never could. I checked my mirrors, expecting to catch the outline of a vehicle pulled off without lights. Maybe some rancher or another researcher who hadn't bothered to call in. The mirrors showed nothing but the sliver of my own trailer and the yawning dark behind. I told myself it was a software hiccup. Thermal cameras can glitch. A bit of stuck data can smear a hot spot around the edge of the image for a while until you power cycle. I considered stopping right there to reset the system, but I was in the middle of a long, gently rolling stretch with no obvious pullout and a healthy respect for how easy it is to misjudge the road's edge out here at night. So I kept moving, promising myself I'd deal with it at the next obvious wide spot. A few miles later, the blob was still there. No matter how I adjusted my speed, creeping down to 20, nudging back up toward 40, it stayed at the same apparent distance, neither dropping away nor crowding closer, always out of reach of my headlights, always hanging just off the truck's flank. I started throwing deliberate tests at it. I'd accelerate briefly, then coast. I'd drift slightly over the center line, then hug the shoulder. With each change, regular animals reacted. Pronghorn heads came up farther out. A jackrabbit froze, then bolted. The small dots of rodents scattered. The anomaly simply rotated around me, sometimes appearing at the right edge of the frame, sometimes flickering to the left, never crossing my direct front, as if it were tracing a perfect circle centered on my driver's seat. Rehook in the middle, because this is where the science brain and the animal brain stopped agreeing. There's a specific wrongness in seeing something that big track you with that kind of mathematical precision, without any of the messy behavior living things usually have. Predators, close distance. Curious animals zigzag. Even other trucks wander a little in their lanes. This thing kept its radius like it was following an equation, not a scent. I pulled off at the first wider patch of dirt I found, a kind of informal turnout where previous drivers had chewed the shoulder into a flatter spot. Gravel popped under the tires as I rolled to a stop. I left the engine running, partly to keep the thermal gear powered, partly because killing it out there felt like stepping too far into the quiet. With the transmission in park and my foot off the brake, I watched the screen. The blob slid smoothly from the right edge, around the bottom, to the left, then held. It did not recede the way a real heat source would if I stopped and let it move through my field of view. It also didn't bloom the way something approaching would. It simply maintained that same not too close, not too far distance, an orbiting ghost. I cracked the window, letting in a breath of high desert air. It was cold, the kind that dries your lips and carries sound a long way. Out there, I should have been able to hear anything substantial moving in the scrub, a cow, a horse, even a person. The only noises were the tick of cooling metal, the faint whir of the thermal unit's fan, and, far off, the lonely rush of wind sliding over rock. No footsteps, no brush rustle, no breathing but my own. I killed the radio for a cleaner read. That's when the static started to change. With the volume turned almost all the way down to nothing, the receiver should have given me a bare hiss when I flicked through channels, a low shh I've learned to tune out. Instead, as I slowly turned the dial, the sound rose and fell in waves that matched the tiny corrections I was unconsciously making to the steering wheel even at a standstill. Turn a hair left. The static swelled, like I was aiming at a distant thunderstorm. Turn right. It dropped to barely audible. I centered the wheel, and it held somewhere in between, a steady, almost breathing noise. I told myself it was interference from the rig's electronics, some feedback loop between the radio and the thermal. The part of me that spent nights alone in blinds listening for things humans aren't usually around to hear wasn't convinced. I shifted back into drive, pulled slowly onto the asphalt, and started moving again, this time paying equal attention to the thermal display and the live landscape sliding past out the windshield. The anomaly kept pace, unwavering. I tried to give it the benefit of the doubt one last time. Maybe there was a low rise or wash parallel to the road that was holding pooled warmer air, some lensing effect making it look like a moving thing. I stopped looking for excuses when it appeared on both sides of the screen at once. I'd taken a gentle bend, enough that the stars ahead had shifted their pattern in the top of the windshield. My hands were steady on the wheel, my speed a consistent 35. The blob, which had been sitting at the right edge, flickered. For a split second it vanished. Then the thermal image showed two bright shapes equidistant on either side of the center, like parentheses closing in. They pulsed in unison with the radio's static swell, brightening and dimming with each micro-adjustment of the wheel. If it had been an artifact, it was the strangest, most malicious-feeling software glitch I'd ever seen. The rational move at that point, from a pure safety standpoint, would have been to turn around and head back the way I'd come, cut the survey short, and reschedule. The problem was that turning around on that road at that hour meant a multi-point maneuver in the dark. My headlights swinging away from the main track into open scrub, my tires flirting with the edge where asphalt turned to who knows what. Every instinct told me that stopping long enough to pivot in place while something I couldn't see traced perfect circles around me was a worse idea than continuing forward toward the distant smear of reservation lights I knew waited eventually. I made a choice then that I still second-guess sometimes. I marked my current coordinates in the notebook with a quick, shaky pen scratch, date, time, large unknown shape, persistent radius. And then I did what you're not supposed to do on unfamiliar roads. I stopped caring about gathering more data and focused entirely on getting out. I pushed the accelerator down harder than I normally would on that kind of surface. The engine note climbed, the truck surged. On the screen, the twin blobs didn't fall back. They brightened a fraction, as if pleased, then kept exactly the same proportional distance. My little island of safety in the middle of an invisible orbit. Rehook near the end, because this is the image that stuck with me more than the circles. When I finally decided to punch it toward the lights and let whatever was out there either fall away or keep up, the last thing the thermal unit ever recorded that night was an open desert or a fleeing animal. It was a perfect, impossible handprint. The last 10 minutes of that run are a smear of details. The static in the radio rose to a roar at one point, then cut out altogether, leaving only the engine and my own breathing. The stars, which had been so bright at the beginning of the night, seemed to dim slightly. Or maybe that was just the way my pupils contracted with every sign of human presence creeping over the horizon. The distant reservation community we work with out there is small, but its lights are like any others when you've been in true dark long enough. A promise more than a destination. I fixed my eyes on that faint glow, ignored the way the thermal blobs danced at the edge of the screen, and told myself over and over that as long as the actual road stayed under my tires, it didn't matter what the instrument said. A few miles out from the first cluster of houses, the thermal monitor flashed once, hard enough to make me flinch. The image went white for a heartbeat, then black. For a second, I thought the unit had died. Then a single frame burned in, the side of my own truck, viewed from an angle that didn't match any of the camera's fixed positions, driver's window filling most of the screen. On that glass, clear as anything I've ever seen in false color, was a handprint. Larger than a human's by at least a third, fingers too long, palm too wide, each digit tapering to an unnaturally fine point. Every part of it glowed hot on the thermal scale, as if whatever had left it had a core temperature well above anything native out there. The angle of the fingers suggested they were pressed from the outside in, as if something had leaned close enough to lay its hand flat against the moving vehicle. Then the feed cut out completely. No error message, no slow pixel fade, just nothing. The radio, which had been dead silent, crackled once with a burst of ordinary mundane chatter in English from somewhere far away. A trucker complaining about road work on a completely different highway, and then settled back into low hiss. Ahead, the lights of the settlement grew into individual sources: porch bulbs, a small gas station sign, a sodium vapor lamp over a dirt lot. I didn't pull over to check the window until I was under that sodium glow, tires crunching on familiar gravel, the outline of a blockhouse I knew well solid and comforting beside me. The air was colder off the pavement, as biting at the skin of my neck as I stepped out. I walked around to the driver's side slowly, feeling foolish even as I did it. In the harsh orange light, the glass showed nothing but a faint sheen of dust, and the smears my own fingers had left earlier adjusting the mirror. No oversized, strange print. No outline at all. If it had ever been there, in a way that could be seen with regular eyes, the desert had already claimed it. Back inside, with the truck powered down and the equipment case open, I powered the thermal back on to see if the last frame had saved. It had. One still image, logged at the exact minute my notebook said I'd decided to floor it toward lights. I printed it later on a bad field printer. The resolution worse than on the screen, but the outline still unmistakable. It lives in a file with the rest of that night's logs, under an entry I doubt I will ever submit formally. Unknown circling heat source. Behavior inconsistent with known fauna. Avoided physical contact, but left apparent thermal artifact. I've been back out on Navajo Route 20 since then. Work doesn't stop because one night got under my skin. The desert is big, and most nights the only things that follow my truck are coyotes hoping for roadkill scraps and dust devils chasing their own tails. But I drive that detour differently now. I mark my data, but I also mark the feeling in the air when the radio static doesn't match the distance to known transmitters, or when the stars feel farther away than they should. And I no longer assume that circling behavior on a thermal monitor belongs automatically to something I'm there to study. If you ever find yourself out there after midnight, alone on a 2-lane cutting through badlands painted gray by starlight, with the nearest town a smudge on the horizon, and your only company the soft hum of electronics, remember this: patterns aren't always yours to decode. Sometimes, when the same shape keeps pace at the edge of your perception no matter how you change your speed or direction, the smartest move is not to turn toward it and try to understand. It's to keep the wheel steady, head for the lights, and let whatever's drawing those circles decide on its own when to let you go. My name is Madeline, and if you've never driven US 180 from Flagstaff to the South Rim after midnight in winter, it's hard to explain how quickly that road can make you feel like the last person left awake on Earth. I'd done the run dozens of times as a seasonal worker at the park, usually after late shifts in the lodge or at the rim stores, with snow dusting the shoulders and the tall pines closing in on either side like dark walls. That night, the flakes were big and lazy, tumbling through my high beams in slow motion, the kind that don't seem dangerous at first because they don't stick too fast. The traffic was almost non-existent. A couple of southbound semis earlier near town, then nothing, just the steady hum of my tires over a light snowpack and the muffled cottony quiet you get when the forest is blanketed and the sky is low. I'd topped off my tank at a station on the north side of Flagstaff, more out of habit than need. The gauge had sat comfortably above 3/4 when I pulled onto 180. My heater worked, the defrost kept a clear tunnel in front of me, and the dashboard clock glowed that soft amber I'd come to associate with this particular kind of tired. I remember thinking that if I could just get through the next hour, I'd be at the dorms, wrapped in a cheap blanket, the canyon a dark void beyond the rim instead of a responsibility. The first miles slid past in that semi-automatic way they do when you know every curve and passing zone by muscle memory. Snowflakes drifted in the beams, tall trunks strobing in and out as my headlights slid over them, an occasional reflector post winking by like a metronome. The procession appeared so gradually that at first I didn't register it as anything separate from the weather. A pair of taillights blinked into existence far ahead, a dim, reddish shimmer low on the road that I assumed belonged to some local heading back toward the park housing. I eased off the gas a little to keep a sensible distance in the conditions. As I drew closer, more lights materialized out of the snow and dark. An old pickup at the front, its bed sidewalls high and boxy, brake lights a deeper red than modern LEDs. Behind it, a long, faded station wagon, the kind with fake wood paneling you only ever see in retro movies anymore. After that, a couple more shapes. Sedan, small truck, none of them looking like they'd rolled off a lot in the last few decades. Their speed was annoyingly consistent, just below the limit, slow enough to keep me from setting my own comfortable pace, fast enough that passing them in that weather felt reckless. I tucked in behind the last one, telling myself I'd rather follow locals who knew the road than lead. The oddness crept in by layers. First, it was the plates. Dim, hard to read through the snow, but clearly bearing old designs. Colors and fonts I hadn't seen on anything but antique photos, one of them with the sunburst style that went out of issue before I was born. Then it was the way they handled the route. There are little turnoffs and side roads along 180 that most people heading to the park at that hour would peel into. Staff housing, maintenance yards, backways to the village. This line of vehicles sailed past every single one, never signaling, never adjusting pace, like they were all locked into the same invisible track. I glanced at my clock out of habit. It read 12:41. A song ended on the radio, and the host's voice came on, tinny and too cheerful for the hour, talking about a weather update. When I looked back a minute later, after only one short stretch of highway, the clock now said 12:33. The minute digits had rolled backward. I blinked, assuming I'd misread it the first time. Digital dashboards glitch sometimes in the cold. I kept driving, counting in my head, 10 seconds, 20, 30, and checked again, 12:31. Another 10-minute jump backwards in less than a minute of real time. It's amazing how fast your body notices when something as mundane as a clock stops obeying the rules. My hands went clammy on the wheel, my breaths suddenly too loud in the cabin. I slapped the dash lightly, like you do when a radio station fades. The display flickered, then held at 12:31 as if nothing had happened. I told myself it was a loose connection. The snow outside thickened briefly, my beams shrinking to a narrower tunnel. The line of old vehicles ahead remained, their lights a string of beads threading through the whiteness. Rehook, because this is the moment I realized I'd somehow stopped being just another car on that road and had become part of something older. When the gauge on my fuel tank dropped a quarter in the span of what couldn't have been more than a couple of miles. I watched the needle sag from safely above, half toward the mark it shouldn't have reached until well into the next day, the little low-fuel icon flickering prematurely. I knew exactly how much gas I'd bought in Flagstaff. There was no way I'd burned that much climbing in such a short time. The hum of the tires changed subtly under me as the snowpack on the lane thickened, that soft crunch of cinders starting to mix into the sound. The vehicles ahead never threw up rooster tails of slush the way you'd expect in those conditions. Their tires seemed to roll through the white without disturbing it, leaving the surface behind them oddly untouched. I tried to convince myself it was just the way the light played on uneven plowing, but the longer I watched, the less that lied to me convincingly. They also never spaced out, never bunched up, just held their perfect intervals, like a train made of separate cars. Somewhere past one of the small sign viewpoints I knew should have been on the right. Its name escaped me in the moment, but I remembered the shape of the turnout sign. The urge to get out from behind them overwhelmed the common sense that had kept me in line. I didn't like how my gauges were behaving. I didn't like the sense that if I kept following, I might never quite arrive. A small plowed turnout appeared on the right, carved into the trees, its edges banked with piled snow. I flipped on my signal and eased over, half expecting one of the other drivers to do the same, to reveal themselves as real people looking for a break. None of them slowed. The antique pickup at the front kept its steady course. The station wagon followed, one taillight dimmer than the other. The sedan behind it drifted very slightly toward the center line as it passed the turnout, then corrected, like a body following a rut. As my car rolled to a stop on the cleared pad, I watched them go by in a kind of held-breath silence. No exhaust plumes in the cold air, no spray from the wheel wells, just silhouettes gliding past one by one, until the last of them, the small truck I'd barely registered before, slid through the curtain of falling snow and out of sight around the next bend. I sat there with the engine idling, listening. On a normal night, vehicles like that would leave behind echoes, a fading growl, The occasional squeak of suspension over a bump, the whoosh of displaced air. There was nothing. The snow absorbed it all. The only sound was my own motor, and, beneath it, a peculiar sense of absence where lane noise should have been. Curiosity and fear wrestled for a solid 20 seconds. Curiosity won just enough to make me open my door and step out. The cold hit me like a wall, air so sharp it burned the inside of my nose. Snowflakes swirled in the beam of my open door light, settling quickly on the cleared asphalt of the turnout. I walked to the edge where it met the main road, boots crunching on cinders, and looked down the highway in the direction the procession had gone. The lane was covered in an even layer of fresh white. No tire tracks, no ruts, no churned-up lines where that string of vehicles should have cut through. Behind me, back toward Flagstaff, my own tracks were clear. 2 dark stripes, where my tires had pushed through to the older snow, edges crisp. Ahead, the road looked untouched, as if no one had driven it since the last pass of a plow. The snowfall was light. There was no way enough had fallen in the few seconds since they'd passed to erase evidence of multiple tons of metal. I don't remember deciding to get back in the car as much as suddenly finding myself behind the wheel again, heart pounding harder than the situation seemed to justify. The clock on the dash now read 12:58. The last time I'd looked before pulling off, it had been stubbornly stuck lower, jumping backwards. The fuel gauge, too, had crept back up a hair, hovering near the mark it should have been at all along. For the first time in half an hour, the instruments and my expectations agreed. The rest of the drive to the south rim was uneventful in the most mundane, blessed way. A snowplow's blinking lights appeared in my mirror at one point, past me with a shower of cinders, and a wave from the driver. The forest opened here and there to reveal distant, faint glows from the park buildings ahead. When I finally pulled through the staff entrance and shut off the engine, the normal creaks and ticks of cooling metal felt like a lullaby. I didn't talk about it for a while. Canyon workers trade plenty of ghost stories. Voices on closed trails, shapes at the rim at odd hours, that sort of thing. I didn't need to add phantom winter convoy that tries to drag you along to the mix. But one night in the dorm kitchen, nursing a late bowl of instant noodles, I overheard one of the older maintenance guys telling a new hire, "If you're ever the last car heading up 180 on a real quiet winter night, and you see a line of old junkers in front of you with plates that don't look right, pull off and let 'em go. Last car always gets invited to join the parade." He said it with a laugh, but his eyes didn't match the joke. Maybe what I saw was just my exhausted brain making metaphors out of snow and taillights. Maybe I hit some weird electrical glitch stretch that happened to sync with a convoy of classic car enthusiasts who like driving in silence. Or maybe, on certain nights, when the snow is just deep enough and the traffic just thin enough, the road up to the canyon remembers all the vehicles that never made it back down. And if you're not careful, it tries to fold you into their route. I can't tell you which it is with any authority. All I know is that since then, when I draw the short straw and end up driving that road last on a winter night, I keep one eye on the clock, one eye on the fuel, and the rest of my attention on making sure the only procession I join is the one that actually stops at the park gate. If you made it through this final tale on Haunted Fears, remember, these drives aren't just stories for the screen. They're warnings from real roads people still use every night. If you've ever had a strange experience on a highway like this, share it in the comments so others know what to watch for when the lanes are empty. Like the video, subscribe, and keep your notifications on so you never miss our next true horror drive into the dark.